Morning Harlan Briggs decided to sell his niece. He didn't even have the decency to wait until the breakfast rush was over. He walked out from behind the back room with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders and his belly pushed forward like a man who had just made the most sensible business decision of his life. The diner was packed 12 men at the counter, 4 tables deep with cattlemen and miners who had ridden in before dawn. Every one of them had a plate in front of them that Evelyn had cooked. Biscuits were hers. The salt pork was hers. The gravy so thick and right that 3 different men had already banged their tin cups on the table asking for more. Harlan waited until the room quieted enough for his voice to carry. "Gentlemen," he said, loud enough that heads turned from the far corner. "I'm a reasonable man, always have been, and a reasonable man knows when he's sitting on something valuable." Nobody looked up from their plates right away. Harlan wasn't a man people rushed to listen to. He talked too much about himself and too little about anything worth hearing. Something in his tone that morning, something slick and satisfied, made the men set down their forks. Evelyn heard it from the kitchen. She was standing at the iron stove with a towel over one shoulder and a cast iron pan in each hand, turning sausages with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this same motion 10,000 times. The kitchen smelled of rendered fat and wood smoke and the particular sharpness of black pepper. She ground herself every morning because the pre-ground stuff tasted like sawdust. She was 22 years old. She had been standing at this stove, in this kitchen, in this diner, since she was 15. She knew the sound of the room the way a musician knows a hall, every scrape and murmur and shift of weight. She knew when something was wrong. She set the pans down and moved to the pass-through opening in the wall. What I'm offering," Harlan said, spreading his hands like a man unveiling a prize at a county fair, was the exclusive cooking services of the finest frontier cook in Garnett County. Maybe in all of Colorado. He paused. Let the words settle. "My niece, Evelyn Hart." The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of men listening, the quiet of men who weren't sure they had heard correctly. Evelyn stood at the pass-through with both hands flat against the wooden counter. She did not move. She wasn't sure she was breathing. "Now I know some of you have been eating her biscuits for years," Harlan continued, still grinning, "and you know what you're getting. She don't just cook. She preserves, she plans, she can feed 40 hands on a ranch without wasting so much as a potato skin. Whoever Turkerts gets the best kitchen manager this side of the Rockies." He smoothed his hand over his vest. "Starting price is $500. There it was. $500. For her." Evelyn felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. Not because she was faint, she had never fainted in her life, and wasn't about to start now, but because some part of her brain was genuinely struggling to process what her ears had just heard. She had known Harlan was greedy. She had known for years he was mean-spirited and lazy, in the way that only men who feel owed something by the world can be mean-spirited and lazy. But this was something else entirely. She pushed through the kitchen door. Room turned to look at her. She stood in the doorway in her work apron and her flour-dusted sleeves, and she looked directly at her uncle, and the look on her face was not the look of a young woman who was ashamed or frightened. It was the look of a woman who had just decided something permanent. "Harlan," she said. "Now, Evie, just hold on." Her voice didn't rise. That was the thing that silenced the room faster than shouting would have. She said it flat and clean, and every man in that diner felt the weight of it. "Don't you stand there and put a price on me like I'm a horse at auction?" Harlan's face shifted. He hadn't expected her to come out. He'd thought she would hear it from the kitchen and swallow it the way she swallowed everything quietly, with her jaw set and her eyes down and her hands still working. That was how she had survived 7 years under his roof. That was the version of Evelyn he had counted on. "It's a business arrangement," he said, and his voice had the careful tone of a man who was starting to realize his plan had a problem. "You'd be working for whoever takes the contract, same as you work here. Nothing different about it." "Nothing different," she repeated. "That's right, you sell horses, Harlan. You sell cattle." She took one step forward. "Don't sell people. I'm selling a work contract." He said it quickly, like speed would make it true. "Perfectly legal. Is it?" It wasn't a question. She looked around the room slowly, at the men watching her, some of them embarrassed, a few of them leaning forward with interest, most of them with their eyes somewhere between their plates and the wall, the way men look when they know something indecent is happening and haven't yet decided what to do about it. "Any of you plan to buy me?" The silence stretched. 2 men near the window stared at their coffee. A cattleman named Pruitt, who ate at the diner every Thursday and always complimented her apple preserves, suddenly found something very interesting about the grain of the table. Then a voice came from the far end of the counter. "How much for a second plate of biscuits?" It was an older ranch hand named Clem, who was 70 years old if he was a day, and who had ridden up before sunrise because the ride was worth it. A few men laughed, and the tension cracked just enough for everyone to breathe. Harlan's jaw tightened. Evelyn turned away from him. She went back into the kitchen. She picked up her pan. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noted this the way she noted most things about herself, with a kind of clinical distance, but she kept her back straight and she kept moving. Because stopping would mean letting him see that he had gotten to her. He had gotten to her. She cracked 4 eggs into the pan in one fluid motion and told herself she was fine. She was not fine. She had arrived at Harlan's diner at 15 years old, with nothing but the coat on her back and the recipes her mother had written in a small leather journal that Evelyn kept hidden in the bottom of her flour sack. Parents had died 6 weeks apart, her father of a lung sickness that had taken him slowly over one terrible winter, her mother of something that Evelyn suspected was grief more than illness, though no one said so. Harlan was her father's brother. He had shown up at the funeral with his hat in his hand and his eyes red, and at the time Evelyn had thought he was mourning. Later she understood he had been calculating. He had a diner in the town of Garnett, Colorado. He needed a cook. He had a niece who had nowhere else to go. Math was simple. He offered her room and board and said he would pay her a fair wage once the business improved. Business improved within the first month of her cooking there. Wage never materialized. Every time she brought it up, Harlan found a reason the winter had been hard. Cattle prices were down. Roof needed fixing. The flour had gone up. There was always something. And Evelyn, who was 15 and then 16 and then 17, and who had no money and nowhere to go, and no family except this man who watched her like a ledger entry, kept cooking. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she was learning, saving, biding her time until she had enough set aside to start something of her own. Problem was that everything she earned went directly into Harlan's pocket. He ran the front of house, collected the money, bought the supplies, and handed Evelyn a small allowance that covered nothing beyond the absolute basics. She ate what she cooked. She wore the same 3 dresses for 2 years until a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who brought her daughter in for pie every Sunday, noticed and quietly left a bundle of fabric at the back door. By 19, Evelyn understood that biding her time was not a plan. Trap. By 20, she had started hiding small amounts of money in the heel of her left boot. Not much. Enough to matter if the moment ever came. By 22, she had saved $11.40. And the moment still had not come. Glenn, her uncle, had just tried to auction her to a room full of strangers. The morning after Harlan's announcement, she sat in the dark of the kitchen at 4 in the morning, the time she always came in to start the bread, before anyone else was awake, and opened her mother's recipe journal. She didn't read it, she just held it. The leather cover had softened over the years, until it fit her hand the way a good tool fits the person who uses it every day. Her mother had written the recipes in her careful, slanting script with little notes in the margins, more salt than you think. And don't rush the onions. And once, under a recipe for venison stew simply, grandmother always said a good meal is love you can taste. Evelyn closed the journal. She was not going to sit here another 7 years. The auction, and that was what it was, no matter what Harlan called it, was scheduled for the following Saturday. Word spread the way word spread in a small frontier town, which was instantly and completely. By Tuesday, Evelyn knew the whole county had heard about it. Women at the dry goods store went quiet when she walked in. 2 ranch wives she had known for years suddenly had pressing reasons to look at the flour bins when she passed. A man she had never met came in for coffee, looked at her for slightly too long, and she knew with certainty he was not there for the coffee. Harlan was pleased with himself. He moved around the diner with a new energy, telling anyone who would listen that he was simply matching talent with opportunity, and that Evelyn should be grateful someone was willing to pay proper value for her skills. She listened to this from the kitchen and said nothing. On Thursday, she did something she had not done in years. She baked a pie for herself. Not for the diner, not for customers, for herself. Deep dish apple with the kind of butter crust that required patience and cold hands and a willingness to work the dough until it was exactly right. She baked it in the small window of time between the lunch rush and dinner prep, when the kitchen was hers. She sat down at the prep table with the whole pie and a fork and ate a piece of it standing up, and then ate another piece, and then sat down on the stool she kept by the back wall and looked at what she had made. It was a very good pie. It was not enough. Saturday came gray and cold, with a sky the color of old pewter that suggested snow without quite committing to it. By 8 in the morning, the diner was full. Evelyn counted 14 men through the pass-through window. Few she recognized ranchers from the valley, a mining company foreman named Jessup who had eaten her stew twice and praised it loudly both times, a man in a good wool coat who she didn't know. Harlan moved through the room, straightening chairs and beaming. Evelyn cooked. She made the biscuits because the biscuits needed making. She turned the sausage because the sausage needed turning. She scrambled the eggs and sliced the salt pork and poured the gravy and passed the plates through the window one after another with the same efficiency she had always had, because she was not going to let this day make her worse at her work. Whatever happened out there, in here she was still herself. She was halfway through the second batch of biscuits when she heard the door. Not Harlan's entrance, which was always announced and loud. This was different. This was a door that opened and closed without drama, and a pair of boots on the floorboards that moved with the unhurried step of someone who didn't feel the need to make an entrance. Evelyn didn't look up. She heard Harlan's voice shift slightly, that particular adjustment in pitch that happened when he was talking to someone he thought might have money. She had been listening to that pitch shift for 7 years, and she could read it the way other people read weather. Welcome, welcome. Sit anywhere you like. We've got a fine spread this morning, and of course, I know why I'm here. The voice was a man's voice. Not loud, not rough. Level. The kind of voice that didn't need extra volume to carry. Evelyn's hands paused for 1 second on the dough. She went back to work. She heard chairs move, heard the murmur of the room settle, heard Harlan clear his throat in the way he did when he was about to make a speech. She had heard that sound so many times she could have scripted what came next, and she was right the same preamble as before. The same careful language of contract and services and exceptional talent, all of it arranged to make selling her sound like a perfectly ordinary business transaction. Biscuits went into the oven. She picked up a clean towel and wiped her hands. None. Then she walked to the pass-through and looked out at the room. She didn't know why she looked. She had decided she wasn't going to watch this. Something in the quality of the room's silence made her look anyway. The man with the level voice was sitting at the far end of the counter. Tall, she could see that even sitting down, the way some men carry height even when they're seated. He had the look of the outdoors on him, a particular weathered quality of someone who spends most of their time under the sky. But his coat was well made, and his boots were clean, which meant money or care or both. He was looking at his coffee cup. He was not looking at her. Every other man in the room, in some way or another, was looking at her. Few were subtle about it. A few were not. This man was looking at his coffee cup with the focused attention of someone who was thinking, not someone who was pretending to think. Harlan was reaching the numbers. Starting at $200, gentlemen, for a full-year contract. $500. The room went still. The man with the level voice said it the same way he had said everything else. Not loudly, not with theatrical emphasis. Just a statement. Number sat in the room the way a stone sits in still water. Harlan blinked. That is yes, that would be. $500. The man reached inside his coat and placed a folded stack of bills on the counter in front of him. Set it down without looking at anyone, the way a man places a tool he is done with. For Evelyn Hart, the room was silent enough that Evelyn could hear the iron stove ticking behind her. She pushed through the kitchen door. She did not plan to. She had planned to stay in the kitchen through whatever happened and deal with the aftermath. But her feet moved, and the door swung, and there she was, standing in the dining room in her apron with her jaw set, looking at the man who had just bought her. He turned and looked at her directly, not the way the others were looking at her, not the calculating look of men doing math in their heads about whether she was worth what he'd paid. Something else. He held her gaze the way a person holds a gaze when they want you to know they're actually seeing you. "Are you Evelyn Hart?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Ethan Caldwell." He didn't stand, not from disrespect, she thought, but because standing would have made it a performance, and he didn't seem interested in performances. "I own the Iron Ridge spread out past Colton Ridge." He paused. "I didn't come here to buy you." Harlan made a strangled sound. "You just put $500 on the counter," Evelyn said. "I did." Ethan Caldwell looked at the money, then at Harlan, then back at her. "But I've got one condition before it changes hands." Harlan's eyes moved between them nervously. Now, the deal is straightforward. She goes where she chooses. Ethan's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The money is for whatever contract you think you're selling. Evelyn Hart decides where she works and when she leaves. Those are my terms. The room was completely still. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and felt something shift behind her ribs. Not hope. She had learned to be careful with hope. Something smaller and more cautious than hope. Something that said, pay attention to this moment. Harlan laughed, but it was the wrong kind of laugh. Too quick. Well, of course she's free to. Her uncle's been collecting her wages for 7 years. Evelyn heard a voice say, realized a beat later it was her own. She hadn't planned to say it. The words came out because they were true and she was tired. Doesn't own me. He never did. That is, Harlan started. True. She looked at him. Every word. The room had the particular silence of men who have witnessed something they aren't sure they should have witnessed. Cattleman near the window. The mining foreman with his hands around his mug. Old Clem at the far end, who had made the biscuit joke on the first day and was now looking at the counter with an expression that might have been shame. Ethan Caldwell looked at Harlan. 7 years of wages, he said, and the flatness of it was somehow worse than if he had shouted it. You're still putting her up for auction. Harlan's face went red. That is a private family matter. Then settle it privately. Ethan picked up the money from the counter. For 1 second, Evelyn thought he was taking it back. Then he set it down again, directly in front of Harlan, with a different quality. Not an offering. More like a statement. The money's for the contract. But if you're a reasonable man, you'll let her go with her back wages, too. Room waited. Harlan looked at the money. He looked at the room full of men who were watching him. He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn held his gaze and said nothing, because she had learned that silence was sometimes the most powerful thing she had. Harlan picked up the money. Fine, he said. His voice was clipped and tight, the voice of a man who is furious but too smart to show it in public. Girl can go. The girl. After 7 years, she was still just the girl. She went back into the kitchen and picked up her mother's recipe journal from where she kept it in the flour bin. She put it in her coat pocket. She took the $11.40 from the heel of her left boot and put it in her other pocket. She took nothing else, because there was nothing else that was hers. She came back out through the kitchen door for the last time. Ethan Caldwell was still at the counter, paying for his coffee. Don't have to come with me, he said without turning around. If you'd rather go somewhere else, I'll make sure you have the money to get there. Evelyn stopped beside him. She thought about the $11.40 in her pocket. She thought about the recipe journal. She thought about 7 years, and a wage that was never paid, and a room above the kitchen, where the wind came through the gaps in the boards every winter. Where's your ranch? She asked. 12 miles north. He set a coin on the counter for the coffee. Past Colton Ridge. Is it a decent kitchen? He turned to look at her then. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile. Something more careful than a smile. It's the best kitchen I've got. That's not an answer. No, he said, it isn't. He picked up his hat. Come see for yourself. Evelyn Hart picked up her coat. She walked out of Harlan's diner without looking back, through the door, and into the cold Colorado morning with the gray sky overhead, and the smell of wood smoke in the air, and 12 miles of road between her and whatever came next. She did not know who Ethan Caldwell was. She did not know what she was walking into. She knew only that she was walking out, and for the first time in 7 years, the direction she was walking was one she had chosen herself. Ride to Iron Ridge took the better part of 2 hours. Ethan had a wagon, which was practical, and a horse on the lead line, which was Evelyn's. He'd brought it for her, which she found strange and said so. Wasn't sure you'd have one, he said. I don't. It's yours. She looked at the horse. A bay mare, steady-looking, with the kind of calm that came from good handling. Brought a horse for a woman you'd never met. Brought a horse because 12 miles is a long way to ride double. He kept his eyes on the road. Practical reasons. Everything a practical reason with you? Considered this. Most things. She decided she could work with that. Wagon moved through the foothills, with the mountains rising white to the west. Road was rutted and hard with early frost, and every jolt was a reminder that Colorado didn't smooth its edges for anyone. Evelyn sat straight and held the bench rail and watched the country pass and said very little, because she was doing what she always did in uncertain situations, cataloging, accessing, waiting for enough information before she said anything she couldn't take back. She had questions, obvious ones. Why had a wealthy rancher, and she could see from the cut of his coat and the quality of the horses that he was, in fact, wealthy, come into a small-town diner and paid $500 for a cook's contract? Could have hired any cook in the territory for a fraction of that. Going rate for a ranch cook was $40 for the season. Gah, he had paid more than 12 times that without blinking. Didn't add up. She turned and looked at him. He was watching the road with the same focused quiet he had shown in the diner. Profile was plain, rather than handsome, a straight nose, a jaw that was probably used to being set hard, the kind of face that didn't show much. Scar above his left eyebrow, thin and white, old enough to be unremarkable. Gah, he looked like a man who had been outdoors for most of his life and had stopped bothering to have opinions about the weather. Why did you do it? She asked. He didn't pretend not to know what she was asking. I've passed through that diner a half-dozen times in the last 3 years. Every time you were in the kitchen. Every time the food was better than anything in the county. He paused. And every time, Harlan Briggs was out front taking the money. That's not an answer either. He was quiet for a moment. My mother worked for a man like that, he said finally. For 9 years. Different circumstances. Same arrangement. His hands were steady on the reins. I was too young to do anything about it. This time I wasn't. Evelyn looked at the road ahead of them. I don't need saving, she said. No, he agreed. You don't. He paused. But sometimes the difference between a bad situation and a worse one is whether someone with money is willing to use it correctly. She thought about that for a long time. The mountains grew larger. Road north was hard and cold and hers to travel. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't ready to. But she didn't argue either. And after a while, the silence between them settled into something less careful. And Evelyn Hart rode 12 miles into a future she hadn't chosen, but was starting slowly. To believe she could make her own. Iron Ridge Ranch appeared through the pines without warning. One moment there was road-frozen mud and wagon ruts cutting between stands of lodgepole pine with the mountains hard and white above them, and then the trees opened up and there it was. Spread across a wide valley floor, like something a man had built with the intention of staying permanently. Not like the mining camps that sprang up overnight and fell apart just as fast, and not like the modest homestead claims that dotted the territory with their single-room cabins and their hopeful kitchen gardens. This was different. This was a place someone had thought about. Evelyn didn't say anything. She had grown up in Colorado. She had seen prosperous ranches. But Iron Ridge was, she searched for the right word, and couldn't find one that didn't sound like flattery, so she settled for accurate large. Main house was stone and log, 2 full stories with a covered porch running the width of the front face and smoke rising from 2 chimneys. Behind it, visible even from the road, stood a proper barn, not a thrown-together shelter, but a real barn with a hayloft and iron fittings on the doors, and beyond that a series of outbuildings she couldn't immediately identify. Cattle dotted the valley in clusters, dark shapes against the frost-brown grass, more of them than she could count at a glance. She counted anyway. How many head? She asked. About 1,100 right now. Fewer after winter. He didn't say this as boasting. Just information, we lost 62 last February. Hard winter? Hard enough. She looked at the cattle, then at the barns, then at the house. $11.40 sat in her coat pocket. She was acutely aware of it. How many hands? She asked. 14 working full season. 8 through winter. He guided the wagon down the slope toward the main yard. Plus a boy named Charlie, who technically helps with the horses, but mostly reads books and pretends he's working. How old? 14, a pause, going on 40, according to himself. Something close to amusement moved through her before she could stop it. Pressed her mouth flat and looked at the barn. Guard was active, even in the cold. 2 men she could see were working near the woodpile, splitting logs with the rhythmic efficiency of men who had done this particular job 1,000 times. A third was crossing from the far outbuilding with a feed bucket. They looked up when the wagon came through the gate. She felt their attention land on her, the way attention always landed quickly. Then away, then back again. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. Tom, he called. The nearest man broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 40s, with a beard the color of iron and the look of someone who had spent most of his adult life outdoors, came over. Glanced at Evelyn with a brief, unsurprised look. The kind of look that said this was not the first time the boss had returned from town with an unexpected variable. This is Evelyn Hart, Ethan said. She'll be running the kitchen. Tom looked at her for a second longer. Morning, she said. Tom handles the ranch operations, Ethan told her. Anything you need for the kitchen, you tell Tom and he'll get it sourced. If he tells you it can't be done, come tell me and we'll figure out why he's wrong." Tom made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That'll happen once." "It already happened twice," Ethan said and turned toward the house. I'll show you the kitchen." Kitchen was at the back of the main house, which was the right place for a kitchen away from the front rooms where visitors sat, close to the woodpile, with a window that faced east so the morning light came in clean. It was larger than the kitchen at Harlan's Diner by a significant margin. It was an iron range with 6 burners and a warming shelf, a deep, dry sink, a pantry room off the back wall with shelves that went floor to ceiling, and a work table made of pine that was long enough to roll pastry on one end and chop vegetables on the other simultaneously. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and turned a slow circle. Range needed blacking. The pantry shelves were poorly organized canned goods mixed in with dry goods mixed in with what appeared to be axle grease, which had no business being in a kitchen at all. Work table had been used as a surface for things other than cooking. She could see the marks where tools had been laid down, the dark stains that were definitely not food. Someone had been using this kitchen as a storage space and a workspace, which meant no one had been running it properly. "What happened to your last cook?" she asked. Ethan leaned in the doorway. "Left in October. His wife had a baby in Pueblo and he went after her. Before him, a woman named Mrs. Portis for 2 years. Before that, ranch hands took turns." He paused. The food was not good. She ran her hand along the edge of the work table. Solid pine, scarred but sound. Pantry had flour, salt, dried beans, canned tomatoes, and what looked like a reasonable supply of smoked meat. There were onions braided and hanging from the ceiling. Someone had bought coffee, which showed some understanding of priorities. "I need axle grease out of this pantry," she said. "Done. And a proper inventory of what's in here. I don't cook blind. Fair, the range needs work. The flue draws wrong, I can hear it from here." She couldn't actually hear it yet, but she had worked with enough iron ranges to know the signs. The particular way the smoke smell distributed itself through the room told her the flue had a partial block. "I'll need someone to clean it before I start using it for anything more than basics." Ethan looked at the range, then back at her. "I'll have Dan look at it tomorrow." "Hey," she said, and then paused. "If that's possible." Studied her for a moment. Not the evaluating look of a man deciding if she was worth the money. Something more like the look of a man recalibrating a calculation. "I'll get Dan now." He left. She stood alone in the kitchen for the first time. She let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, for approximately 3 hours. The room was on the second floor of the main house, at the end of the hallway. Small but real, a bed with an actual frame, a washstand, a window with a view of the eastern ridge where the aspens had gone gold and skeletal for winter. There was a hook on the wall for her coat and a small chest of drawers that was empty, except for a mouse's old nest in the bottom drawer, which she removed without particular drama. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room. 7 years of sleeping in the room above Harlan's kitchen, where the floor was crooked and the wind came through the walls, and she could hear the man snoring through the boards. This room was small. It was cold. The plaster had a crack in the far corner that would need watching in a wet spring. The door had a latch, and the latch was on the inside. And when she reached over and pressed it into place, the click of it was one of the quieter, extraordinary things she had ever heard. She took out her mother's recipe journal and set it on the chest of drawers. She took out $11.40 and counted it, not because she needed to. She knew exactly how much was there, but because the counting was a habit she couldn't break. Every cent verified, every cent real. She put the money back in her pocket. She was not going to spend it. Not yet. Whatever Ethan Caldwell paid her, it went in the boot. The $11 stayed where it was, because it was the only thing in the world that was completely and entirely hers. Dinner on the first night was a test she gave herself without telling anyone. She had 2 hours, and a freshly cleaned flue in a pantry that she had reorganized herself in the late afternoon, while a young man named Charlie watched from the doorway with the particular expression of someone trying to look like they weren't watching. "You can come in," she said without turning around. Silence. Then footsteps. "Tom said not to bother you." Tom's not wrong most of the time. She moved a sack of dried beans to the proper shelf. But standing in the doorway's worse than coming in. Drafts. Charlie came in. He was thin in the way of boys who had grown fast and hadn't caught up with themselves yet, all elbows and a neck that seemed slightly too long. He had ink stains on 3 fingers of his right hand, and hay in his left boot, and his hair needed cutting badly enough that it was starting to make its own decisions about direction. "You read?" she asked, because Tom had said it, and she was curious. "Yes, ma'am." "What?" He looked suspicious, the way people look when they expect a question like that to lead somewhere bad. "Whatever Mr. Caldwell has, he's got a fair library." She looked at him. "And what does Mr. Caldwell read?" "History, mostly. Land law, some poetry. But he keeps that on the lower shelf like he doesn't want anyone to notice." She found this piece of information unexpectedly interesting and set it aside to think about later. "What's your name?" "Charlie Voss." "You work the horses?" "Yes, ma'am." He paused. "And other things." "What other things?" "Whatever needs doing." He said it with the careful dignity of a boy who had probably had to explain his value more than once to more than one person. She handed him a turnip. "Peel that." He looked at the turnip. "I'm not a kitchen hand," he said, but without heat. More like he was clarifying a point of professional record. "I know, but you're here and I need this peeled. And you've got two hands that aren't doing anything useful right now." She handed him a knife. "Motion is away from you, not toward." He peeled the turnip. But it was a start. She made a thick beef stew with turnips and onion, and a bay leaf she found pressed flat in the back of the spice shelf. And she made biscuits, not the full quantity batch she would have made at the diner, but a good workmanlike dozen. Enough for a table of 8, risen properly and brown on top. She made coffee strong enough to be useful and weak enough not to be rude about it. When the hands came in from evening chores, she watched them from the kitchen doorway the way she always watched a new room taking inventory, noting dynamics, reading the arrangement of men around a table for what it told her about how things actually worked here. 8 of them for winter, as Ethan had said. Ranged from a boy barely older than Charlie to a man called Hatchet, who had to be 60, and who moved with the particular careful deliberateness of someone nursing an old back injury. Gaw, they were tired. She could see it in the way they sat down. Specific quality of exhaustion that comes from outdoor work in cold weather, not just physically worn, but weathered. The way wood weathers, until the surface gets tight and close-grained. They ate without talking much. That told her something. Harlan's diner, the men talked while they ate. They complained, they bragged, they argued about cattle prices and water rights and whose horse was faster. Noise was the natural state of a room full of hungry men. These men were quiet, and it wasn't the comfortable quiet of satisfaction. It was the quiet of men who had been eating bad food for long enough that they had stopped expecting anything from a meal except fuel. Hatchet, the older man with the bad back, took his first spoonful of stew and stopped. Looked down at his bowl. He took another spoonful. He said nothing, but he straightened slightly in his chair, and Evelyn saw it from the kitchen doorway and felt something settle in her chest. That was the thing most people didn't understand about cooking. The moment wasn't the compliment, wasn't the word someone said. Was that small involuntary adjustment, the body responding to something real before the mind had even processed it. Charlie caught her eye from the end of the table and grinned. She went back into the kitchen and started washing up. Ethan ate at the table with his men, which she noted and filed away. A lot of ranch owners didn't. Some ate separately, or ate early, or made it clear by timing and location that however the work was shared, the social hierarchy was not. Ethan sat at the head of the table because that was where the head of the table was, not because he made a production of it. Came into the kitchen afterward. She was drying the last of the bowls. She heard his boots and didn't turn around. The men haven't eaten like that since Mrs. Portis left, he said. How long ago was that? 14 months. She turned around then. 14 months of ranch hands taking turns at the stove. One very dedicated attempt by Tom to make what he called a reasonable soup. What happened? 3 men asked if the horse was sick. He said it flatly, without smiling, which was somehow funnier than if he'd smiled. I didn't tell Tom that. She put the bowl on the shelf. Smart. He leaned against the doorframe, the same doorframe Charlie had stood in earlier, which was apparently where men stationed themselves when they weren't sure if they were welcome in the kitchen. What do you need? He asked. For the kitchen. Make a list and I'll have Tom get it. She had already been making the list in her head. She gave it to him without preamble: more salt pork, vinegar for preserving, more dried beans, fresh onions before the winter stock got any older, a replacement for the cracked pot on the middle shelf, and a proper sharpening stone, because whoever had been using the kitchen knives had apparently been sharpening them on the flagstone floor. Listened without writing any of it down. You won't remember all that. she said. I will. You're sure? I've been managing inventory on a ranch of this size for 11 years, he said. I remember lists. She looked at him. How old are you? Paused. Not offense, more like the question surprised him. 34. You've owned this ranch since you were 23? Bought the first 300 acres at 21. Rest came later. He turned to go, then stopped. Wage is $40 a month. First of the month, cash. He said it the way he said most things, as information, not negotiation. That's not acceptable. It's acceptable, she said. $40 a month was more than double what Harlan had been claiming to pay her, and roughly triple what she'd actually seen of it. She kept her face where it was, which required some effort. One more thing, he said. She looked at him. You're free to leave whenever you want. If you find something better, or somewhere better, I won't hold the contract against you. What Briggs sold me was a piece of paper. Paper doesn't mean anything if you don't want to be here. Evelyn held his gaze. Why are you telling me that? Seemed to consider this more seriously than she expected. Because I've seen what happens when people feel trapped, he said. It doesn't produce good work, and it's not right. He straightened from the doorframe. Good night, Miss Hart. Good night, she said. She stood in the kitchen after he left and listened to the sound of the house settling around her, the pop of the cooling range, the wind against the east window, the distant sound of men in the bunkhouse. Somewhere in the main house, a floorboard creaked as Ethan Caldwell walked to whatever room he occupied at the end of his day. She picked up her mother's recipe journal from where she had set it on the windowsill while she worked and slipped it back into her apron pocket. $40 a month. A kitchen with 6 burners. Door with a latch on the inside. She was not safe yet. She understood that. 7 years of Harlan had made her smart enough not to mistake comfort for safety. Something had shifted, and she was honest enough to feel it, even if she wasn't ready to name it. Days at Iron Ridge fell into a pattern with the natural efficiency of water, finding the path of least resistance. She was up before 4, the range lit by 4:15, bread in the oven by 5. Breakfast for 8 men and 1 ranch owner at 6, with enough left on the warming shelf for whoever came in late from night work. Midday meal at noon if the men were close enough to ride in for it, cold packs wrapped in cloth and sent out on the wagon if they weren't. Dinner at 6:30, with the table cleared by 8 and the kitchen cleaned and reset for the next morning before she went to bed. It was the same rhythm she had always kept, but it felt different here. At Harlan's, rhythm had been survival, keep the plates moving, keep the customers satisfied, keep her uncle from having a reason to remind her of what she owed him. Here, the rhythm was just work. The work was real and it mattered, and people were genuinely glad for it. And that difference, which sounded small, and probably was small, in the absolute scale of things made every morning feel less like something she had to push through. Started to experiment. At Harlan's, she had cooked what the customers expected. You didn't change the menu on a frontier diner. You made what men knew, and you made it reliably. Here, she was feeding the same 14 people every day 8 through winter, the full crew by spring, and she could try things. She added dried chilies to the pork and bean stew because she had found a paper sack of them on the back pantry shelf and because she was curious. She added cider vinegar to the braised short ribs and let them cook longer than was strictly necessary. She made sourdough with the starter she built from scratch in a clay crock she found in the back of the pantry, feeding it every morning with a measured amount of flour and water until it smelled right. Men didn't say much. Frontier men generally didn't narrate their appreciation for food that wasn't how it worked. Things changed in small, telling ways. Hatch stopped eating with one hand under the table, supporting his back, and started eating with both hands, which meant he was relaxed enough to forget about the pain for a few minutes. A man named Burl, who had been eating fast in the way of someone who expects interruption, started slowing down. Charlie started showing up to the kitchen doorway around 5:30, ostensibly to get a glass of water, actually to watch, and occasionally be handed something to peel. She didn't comment on any of it. She just cooked. 3 weeks into her time at Iron Ridge, a man arrived. Not a regular visitor, she had started to recognize the pattern of regular visitors. The feed merchant from town who came Tuesdays, the neighboring rancher named Gentry, who stopped in once a week to talk cattle with Tom. This was different. A buggy she didn't recognize came through the gate on a Wednesday morning, and the man who climbed down from it wore a suit that hadn't been made in Colorado. She was crossing the yard from the woodpile when he arrived, carrying an armload of split logs, and she saw the look that passed across his face when he noticed her. Not recognition, he didn't know her. Something else. Rapid assessment, the kind that happened too fast for the person doing it to hide. Took in the apron and the wood and made some internal calculation. You there, he said. Is Caldwell available? She looked at him. I'll let him know you're here. Who should I say is calling? Gave her a name, Marcus Reel, which she did not recognize, and she went inside and told Ethan there was a man in a city suit in the yard who looked like he had opinions. Ethan's face changed in a way that was hard to read, not fear, but something careful. Tightening. Did he give his company? Just his name. Lee. He set down what he was doing and went out. Evelyn went back to the kitchen and made coffee, because coffee was what you made when men were about to have a meeting that mattered. He wasn't trying to listen. The kitchen window was open because the range had heated the room past comfortable, and voices carry in cold air. That wasn't her fault. Territory surveyor has already confirmed the water boundary, Reel was saying. He had a voice that was accustomed to boardrooms. Not loud, but built to project certainty. Our company's claim on the Upper Creek predates your deed by 6 years. That's not what the county recorder shows. Ethan's voice had the same flat quality it always had, but there was something different under it. Controlled. I've held water rights on the North Fork since 1871. Those records may need to be reviewed. A pause. Reviewed, Ethan repeated. There are irregularities in the filing. My company's legal team is prepared to address them through the appropriate channels. Of course, a pause that felt deliberate. These things can take time and expense to resolve. If you were open to a conversation about the value of Iron Ridge as a whole, we might be able to save everyone a great deal of difficulty. He was offering to buy the ranch, or threatening to take the water rights and make the ranch worthless enough that selling it would seem like Ethan's own idea. Evelyn poured coffee into a pot and set it on the warming shelf and stood very still for a moment. She had grown up on the frontier. She knew what losing water rights meant for a cattle operation. Without access to the North Fork Creek, Iron Ridge's grazing land would fail within 2 seasons. Ethan would have 1,100 head of cattle and nowhere near enough water to support them. She listened to Ethan say, with the exact precision of a man choosing every word, my legal position is sound. I'm not interested in a conversation about selling Iron Ridge. Reel said something she didn't catch. Ethan said, then I'll see you in the county recorder's office. Boots crossed the yard. The buggy left. Evelyn had the coffee ready when Ethan came into the kitchen. He stood at the door for a moment, the particular stillness of a man absorbing something unpleasant before he let himself react to it. Coffee, she said. He looked up. Something flickered, she wasn't sure what. When you heard was open. He came to the table and sat. Gavin. She poured him a cup and set it in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it and looked at the surface of the coffee the way a man looks at something he is trying to think through without showing that he is thinking. Is the legal position actually sound? She asked. Looked at her. You said it was sound, she said. A long pause. Mostly. What's the mostly? Gap in the filing in 74. A missed renewal. Corrected, and there's a paper trail, but he stopped. Good enough lawyer could make it complicated. And they have a good enough lawyer. They have several. He drank the coffee. Marcus Reel works for a land syndicate out of Denver. They've been moving through this county for 2 years. They're looking at water rights on 6 different properties. The idea is to control water, then control the land that depends on it. Evelyn sat down across from him without asking if it was all right to sit. She had a feeling formality wasn't the point right now. Who else have they gone after? Sheet Gentry. The Halverson place. A homesteader family called the Wares. He set the cup down. Wares sold last month. 50 acres of prime creek frontage for $400. Worth $4,000 minimum. They pressured them out. Complicated their lives until the uncomplicated option was to sell. He said it without heat, but the absence of heat was its own kind of intensity. That's how it works. Make it so costly and so exhausting that selling seems like relief. Evelyn thought about Harlan. She thought about 7 years of exhaustion worn down to nothing, of $11.40 in a boot heel, of 1 tin plate of food a day treated like a concession. It doesn't work, she said, if you don't exhaust. He looked at her. If you stay healthy and solvent and you don't make mistakes, she said, the strategy fails. Counting on you being tired. Don't be tired. He looked at her for a long moment, not the way the men in Harlan's diner had looked at her. Gama, more like someone encountering an argument they hadn't considered and weren't sure yet whether to agree with. Dealt with men like Reel before, he said. Not with money, she said, but the shape of it is the same. She stood up. I'll put more coffee on. After that morning, Something shifted between them, not dramatically. Not in any way either of them acknowledged, but perceptibly. Distance appropriate to an employer and his kitchen worker stayed in place. But underneath it, conversations started that were a different kind of conversation. He started coming into the kitchen in the early evenings when the dinner rush was done and the hands were in the bunkhouse. Not every evening, 3 or 4 times a week. He would sit at the work table with a ledger or a document, and she would be doing prep for the next morning, and they would talk or not talk in a way that had a natural rhythm to it that neither of them had planned. She learned things without trying to. He had grown up in Kansas, the second of 4 children, and his father had worked other men's land until Ethan was 20 and had saved enough of his own money to move west and buy the first 300 acres of what would eventually become Iron Ridge. He had built the operation piece by piece, not through a single stroke of fortune, but through 11 years of specific, grinding work. He was not a man who had inherited wealth. He was a man who had built it, which was a different thing. She also learned that he had been married. She didn't ask. Came out in fragments, over several evenings, a reference to Clara in passing, the way someone mentions the name of a place they used to live. Clara had died of fever 4 years ago, before the ranch reached its current size. Ethan mentioned this with the careful matter-of-factness of someone who has made peace with a thing that still, occasionally, ambushes him. Didn't ask for sympathy, and she didn't offer it, which she thought was probably what he wanted. She told him about her parents, in similar fragments her father's laugh, which had been too big for a small man, her mother's habit of humming tunelessly while she cooked, a different tune every day, never the same one twice, recipe journal and what was in it, the way the journal smelled faintly of the dried lavender her mother kept in the kitchen, even now, years later. She sounds like someone worth knowing, Ethan said one evening. She was. Evelyn was shaping rolls, pressing each one to the same size by feel. She would have hated Harlan. Most people did. She would have said so to his face. She pressed another roll flat. She had a way of saying true things very quietly. It was worse than yelling. She paused. I didn't inherit that. Got louder, I noticed, he said. She looked up. There it was again, that thing that wasn't quite a smile, that careful pull at the corner of his mouth. She had been cataloging it without meaning to, the way she cataloged everything at Iron Ridge. How many times it appeared. What preceded it. She looked back at her rolls. Smirk, she said. I wasn't. You were about to. Pause. Possibly. She put the rolls in the pan and covered them with a cloth for the overnight rise, and told herself that the warmth in her chest was from the range. January, a letter arrived from Garnet. Tom brought it to the kitchen in the late afternoon, handed it to her without comment, in the way that Tom did most things efficiently and without editorial. She turned it over in her hands before she opened it. The handwriting on the outside was Harlan's. She considered briefly throwing it in the range. And she opened it. It was not long. 3 paragraphs in Harlan's cramped and slightly erratic hand that managed to contain more self-justification per sentence than she had thought possible even from him. Gist of it, stripped of everything else, was this: Diner was struggling without her cooking. He wanted her back. He was willing to, as he put it, reconsider the arrangements. He did not specify what that reconsideration would look like, but the implication was that the fact of reconsidering should be enough to move her. At the bottom, as a postscript that he clearly thought was a closing argument, you always were ungrateful. Mother would be ashamed. Evelyn read that line 3 times. Then she folded the letter carefully in half. Then in half again, and set it on the prep table. Gan went back to work. Charlie came in around 5 and found her making pie crust with the focused precision of someone who was not thinking about pie crust at all. Okay? He asked. Fine. He looked at the folded letter on the table. Is that bad news? No, she said. It's old news. She pushed the dough flat with her palm. Which is different. He seemed to accept this. He picked up an apple from the basket near the window and leaned against the counter. Caldwell says the real company filed a challenge at the county recorder's office. Her hand stopped on the dough. When, this morning? Tom got a rider from town. Charlie turned the apple in his hands. Mr. Caldwell's been in his study since noon. She set down the rolling pin, picked up the folded letter from the table, and put it in the range. Then she put together a tray coffee, 2 slices of the dried apple cake that was left from last night's dinner, a folded napkin, because she believed in napkins, regardless of what anyone thought about that, and she carried it down the hall to Ethan's study door and knocked. Pause. Come in. He was at his desk with papers spread across every surface, and there were more papers on the chair beside him, and he had the look of a man who had been fighting a battle with documents for several hours and had not been winning. She set the tray on the edge of the desk where there was room. He looked at it. He looked at her. "The challenge is about the 74 gap?" she asked. "Among other things." He picked up the coffee without being asked. "They've got a surveyor who's willing to testify that the original boundary markers are misplaced. If that holds, does he have documentation? He will by the time he testifies. Good at producing documentation." She stood at the edge of the desk. "What does your deed say specifically?" He looked up at her. "Oh, why? Because I've been listening to you describe the problem for 3 minutes and I haven't heard the solution yet," she said. "The deed say." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed a document across the desk toward her. She picked it up. She was not a lawyer. She knew this. She could read, and she had spent 7 years running a business, even someone else's business, which meant she understood documents, the way people understand languages they've been immersed in without formal instruction. She read the deed carefully, line by line, while Ethan watched her. "Here," she said, and put her finger on a clause near the bottom of the second page. "Natural landmark reference. The deed ties the North Fork boundary to the position of a specific rock formation, not to the survey stakes." He looked where she was pointing. "The stakes can be misplaced," she said. "Rock formation can't. It's still there. It was there in 1871, and it's there now." Read the clause. "Read it again." He set the document down and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly. Something more fundamental. The look of a man who has been staring at a map upside down and has just been handed the correct orientation. "My lawyer missed that," he said. "Your lawyer is probably good with courtrooms," she said. "I've been reading your pantry inventory for 2 months. I noticed specific details." He almost smiled nearly. "I need to send a rider to my lawyer tonight. I'll have food ready for the rider in 20 minutes. She picked up the tray he'd drunk the coffee and eaten both pieces of cake. She noted and carried it back to the kitchen. "Look now." She stood at the window for a moment with her hands on the edge of the sink and looked out at the dark line of the eastern ridge against the last of the winter light. The day had been long and it wasn't done yet, and tomorrow would be just as complicated. She realized, not afraid of that. She didn't examine the feeling too closely. She had learned at Iron Ridge to be careful about naming things before they were ready to be named. She stood at the window and felt it something that was not hope, and was not safety, and was not comfort, but was perhaps the beginning of all three, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as the light lasted on the ridge. Then she went back to the stove, and she kept working. Rider Ethan sent to his lawyer that night came back 2 days later with a letter that said, in the careful language of a man paid to be careful with language, that the rock formation clause was significant, and that he would file a counter motion with the county recorder's office within the week. He also said in a postscript that was less careful that the real syndicate had retained 3 lawyers and a professional surveyor, and that Ethan should prepare for this to take time. Time was the one thing the syndicate understood as a weapon. Evelyn read the letter over Ethan's shoulder. He had stopped pretending she shouldn't be involved in anything that happened in this house, and said nothing until she reached the end. "He's right that it'll take time," she said. "He's wrong that time is the problem." Ethan looked at her. "What's the problem?" "Money." She set the letter on the desk. "Legal fights cost money. They know that. If they can keep you spending on lawyers long enough, the financial pressure does the rest." She paused. "How solvent are you right now?" The question landed in the room with a flat, practical weight that most people would have avoided asking. She wasn't most people. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not evasion. She had learned to read him well enough by now to know the difference between evasion and actual calculation. He was calculating. "Solvent enough for 2 seasons," he said. "Maybe 3 if the spring cattle prices hold. And if they don't hold, then we have a different conversation." She picked up the letter and folded it along its original creases. "Then keep the cattle healthy, keep the hands working, and don't give them a mistake to exploit." She set it back down. "You already know this. Sometimes it helps to hear it from someone who isn't the one worrying about it." "Gah," she looked at him. It was February now, and she had been at Iron Ridge for nearly 3 months. And she had stopped counting the days the way she had counted days at Harlan's, which was a thing she had not yet decided what to do with. "Are you worried about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I built this place from nothing. The idea of losing it to men who produce paperwork instead of anything real." He stopped. Yes, I'm worried about it. She sat down in the chair across from him. Tell me about the water situation. The actual situation, not the legal one, he told her. The North Fork Creek ran through the northern quarter of Iron Ridge's grazing land, providing water for roughly 400 head in summer and a critical supplement for the whole herd through dry spells. Without it, he would need to sink 3 additional wells, cost of which was substantial. And even then, the water table in the valley ran unpredictable in drought years. Syndicate's strategy was transparent: establish legal ambiguity over the creek rights, then offer to resolve the ambiguity in exchange for a portion of the land. Not all of it, just enough to make the remaining portion unworkable as an independent operation. They don't want to own a ranch, Ethan said. They want to own the piece of the ranch that makes the rest of it worthless. Then you sell the rest for whatever they offer. At which point, they own everything they need for maybe a third of what it's worth. Evelyn sat with this for a moment. She thought about the Ware family, who had sold 50 acres of creek frontage for $400. She thought about the gap between $400 and what that land was actually worth. And she thought about the people who had done the calculating on both sides of that transaction, and what it meant about the kind of men she was dealing with. How many other ranchers in the county are in a similar position, she asked. 4 that I know of, possibly more. Are any of them talking to each other? Ethan paused. She could see him adjusting, the way a man adjusts when a conversation takes a turn he hadn't anticipated. Not schematically. They should be, she said. A syndicate is harder to pressure when the properties it's targeting are coordinating their response. She paused. Said Gentry's been approached. Last October. And the Halverson place? December. She looked at the desk. 3 ranchers, with documentation of contact from the same company. That's not nothing at a county recorder's office, or a territorial court. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for a blank piece of paper and a pen. Coordination meeting happened 3 weeks later at Iron Ridge, in the main room that Evelyn had never seen used for anything other than storage. She moved the furniture herself, Charlie's assistance and Tom's grudging contribution, set up a long table with chairs enough for 8, and she made coffee and a quantity of cornbread that she calculated would be sufficient without being so excessive that it looked like she was trying to impress anyone. She was not at the meeting. This was deliberate. Gentry and the other rancher, a taciturn Norwegian named Halverson, who communicated primarily through eyebrow position, were old-fashioned enough that a woman at a business meeting would have become the meeting. She had more important things to do than manage that particular dynamic. She was in the kitchen, which shared a wall with the main room, and the wall was not particularly thick. She heard enough. The meeting lasted 3 hours. There was argument, which she had expected. Men with adjacent land rarely agreed on principle before they agreed on necessity, and necessity had to be established before principle became negotiable. Gentry was cautious. Halverson was stubborn in a different direction from cautious, which was worse in some ways and better in others. Ethan was patient in the way of a man who had done the calculation before the meeting started and was prepared to wait until everyone else reached the same answer. By the time the cornbread was gone, they had agreed to share documentation and coordinate their legal responses through the same filing at the territorial court. It was not a victory, but it was a position. After the men left, Ethan came into the kitchen with the look of someone who has just done something exhausting and is unsure whether it was worth it. Well, Evelyn said. Halverson agreed to everything after the 2nd hour. Gentry took until the 3rd. What changed Gentry's mind? His wife apparently had strong opinions that she communicated to him on the ride over, Ethan said. Claimed it was his own thinking. Nobody argued. Evelyn poured him coffee. Smart woman. He sat down at the work table. Charlie had left a book there, a battered history of the Texas cattle drives, that was missing its first 12 pages, and Ethan moved it to one side without looking at it. Territorial filing gives us standing to challenge the syndicate's water claims as a coordinated pattern rather than individual disputes. My lawyer thinks it changes the timeline considerably. How considerably? Enough that Real may decide Garnett County is more trouble than it's worth. She said nothing. You don't look convinced, he said. I think men like Real decide what's worth their trouble based on what they've already invested, she said. They've got 3 lawyers and a surveyor in this. That's not cheap. They're not going to walk away from that easily. Drank the coffee. No, probably not. So prepare for it to get worse before it gets better. That's a bleak assessment. That's an accurate assessment. She sat down across from him. Bleak and accurate aren't the same thing. He looked at her across the table. Kitchen was warm from the day's cooking, and the late afternoon light came in through the east window at a low angle that turned everything slightly gold. And there was a moment, just a moment, where neither of them said anything, and the silence had a different quality from the comfortable silences that had become ordinary between them. She stood up and went back to the stove. "Dinner in an hour," she said. The storm arrived in the first week of March without particular announcement. Colorado storms rarely announced themselves with drama in the days before. Came in the way bad luck tends to come gradually, and then suddenly. Sky went gray on a Sunday. By Monday evening it had gone the particular white gray of serious intent, the color that old-timers recognized as trouble. But by Tuesday morning, the snow was coming down horizontal, and the temperature had dropped far enough that the water in the yard trough had iced over, despite Burl having broken it twice in the night. By Tuesday noon, the road to Garnet was gone. Not blocked gone, buried deep enough under drifting snow that its location was a matter of memory rather than observation. Mountains disappeared. The ridgeline that Evelyn had been watching from her kitchen window every morning for 3 months disappeared. The world contracted to the space between the main house and the barn, and even that crossing required a rope line strung between the two buildings to keep from losing direction in the white. She had known it was coming. This was not intuition. It was the pantry. 2 weeks before the storm arrived, she had started paying different attention to the food stores. Not the normal attention of a cook managing week-to-week supplies, but a different kind, longer range, harder edged. She counted what was there and calculated what 14 men required per day, and did the arithmetic on how long the current stores would last if the roads went out. Arithmetic was not comfortable. She had gone to Tom. "We need more salt pork," she said, "and flour, and dried beans. And whatever you have in the root cellar needs to come into the house, because if we get a hard freeze, the cellar door is going to be inaccessible." Tom had looked at her with the expression of a man who has been managing a ranch operation for many years and has occasionally received advice from people who understood less than they thought they did. "February's been mild. February," she said, "is over." Thought about this for a moment. "I'll look at what we've got. I'll come with you." They had done the inventory together, which was not something Tom had clearly anticipated, but which he accepted with the philosophical resignation of a man who had learned when arguing was inefficient. Root cellar had a good supply of turnips and carrots, and 3 barrels of apples that were beginning to get soft at the edges. Smokehouse had 2 sides of pork, and what she estimated was 40 pounds of dried beef. The flour was adequate if she was careful. The salt was fine. Coffee was low. "Get more coffee," she said. "Whatever happens, men work better when there's coffee." Tom had ordered more supplies. They arrived 3 days before the storm. She had not said anything to anyone about this calculation. She had just done it, the way she had done calculations her whole life, quietly, precisely, without waiting to be asked. 5th day of the storm was when the situation became something other than merely difficult. Cattle were the first problem. 1,100 head in open-range country could shelter in natural draws and tree lines to a point, but a storm of this duration and severity drove them into clusters that created their own dangers. Animals pressed together too tightly. Weakest ones pushed to the edges, where exposure finished them. Tom organized the hands in rotating shifts to push the herd toward the protected draws, but with the temperature where it was and the snow coming sideways, each shift came back in worse shape than the last. Hatchett came in from a shift on the 5th afternoon, with his hands too cold to unbutton his coat. Evelyn saw this from the kitchen and crossed the main room to him without hesitation. "Come here," she said, took him to the kitchen and put his hands in a basin of water that was cool. Not warm. She had learned the difference from a woman in Garnet who had nursed a trapper back to full use of his fingers after a bad winter. Warm water on badly cold hands did damage. Cool water first, then gradual warming. Hatchett submitted to this without comment, which told her more about how bad his hands were than any amount of complaint would have. "How many men are out?" she asked. "Burl and the Mackay brothers," he said through chattering teeth. "Tom's with them." "When are they due back?" "Supposed to be an hour ago." Kept her face where it was and changed the water in the basin to something slightly less cold. "Know the rope line?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then they know their way back." 40 minutes later, Tom and Burl and the Mackay brothers came in through the back door in a cluster, covered in snow and moving with the careful deliberateness of men who are cold enough that moving carefully is a necessity. She had soup on the stove. She had not made it for this reason. She had made it because soup was what you made when the temperature was this low, and men were working in it, but it was there and hot, and she filled bowls without being asked and set them on the table. Burl sat down and wrapped his hands around the bowl before he touched the spoon. "Thank you," he said. It was possibly the most words she had heard from Burl in 3 months. "Don't thank me," she said. "Eat, then sleep if you can." On the 6th day, Ethan got the message. It came from an unexpected direction, a ranch hand from the Gentry spread, who had ridden through the storm with the particular desperation of someone carrying information too urgent to wait. He arrived half-frozen and barely coherent, and it took coffee and 20 minutes of warming before he could speak clearly enough to be understood. What he said was this: a group of armed men, he counted 6, possibly 8, had been seen moving toward the north end of Iron Ridge's property. Gentry Hand had been at the northern fence line when the storm was lighter, checking on their own cattle, and had seen the riders cross Gentry's land heading south, heading toward Iron Ridge, toward the North Fork Creek. Evelyn was in the kitchen when Ethan came in with this information. He told her directly, without the pause that a different man might have taken to decide whether she needed to know. She had stopped being someone he managed information around sometime around the rock formation clause in January, and she suspected he had stopped thinking of her that way even before she'd noticed. "Reals men," she said, "most likely. In this storm." She looked out the window at the white wall of nothing where the yard used to be, using the storm as cover, or as timing. If they can establish physical presence at the creek boundary during a period when we can't easily get there to dispute it. He stopped. Surveyor doesn't need good weather to drive a stake. She understood. A fraudulent boundary stake, placed while the storm made any witness impossible, would be physical evidence that the syndicate's surveyor had been on the land, which created a record that could be used to argue the boundary dispute had been actively contested on the ground, not just in documents. "How many men do we have who can ride?" she asked. 5 who aren't coming off a shift. He said it with the flat honesty of a man assessing a bad hand. "Tom, Burl, Mackay Sr., myself. 4. She looked at the stove. She looked at the window. Guplin. She looked at Ethan Caldwell standing in the kitchen doorway with the storm behind him and a problem in front of him that couldn't be solved by waiting, and she felt something happen in her chest that wasn't fear but wasn't its opposite either. "Then go," she said. "I'll handle the ranch." He looked at her. "Evelyn, I've been managing food stores for 16 men in a blizzard for 6 days, she said. "I know where every piece of wood is in this house. I know which cattle are in which draw. I know how much flour is left and exactly how to make it last another week if we need to. Go deal with the men coming onto your land and trust me to deal with everything here." He held her gaze for a long moment. She held it back. There was no performance in it on either side. It was just 2 people who had spent 3 months learning the weight of each other's judgment, conducting one final quick assessment. "Charlie stays with you," he said. "Charlie stays with me," she agreed. "Anything, I'll handle it," she said. "Go." He went. The 4 of them, Ethan, Tom, Burl, Mackay Sr., disappeared into the white within 30 seconds of leaving the yard. Rope line only went as far as the barn. Beyond that, they were on their own with compass bearings and the particular animal intelligence of men who had been navigating this land for years and knew it the way she knew her kitchen by feel, by sound, by the specific weight of things that were exactly where they were supposed to be. Charlie came to stand beside her at the kitchen window. "They'll be okay," he said. It came out slightly too quick, the way reassurance comes out when the person saying it is reassuring themselves. "Yes," she said, because this was what she believed, and because she wasn't going to waste energy on alternatives. "What do we do?" She turned from the window. "Feed what's left of the crew. Make sure Hatchet keeps those hands moving. Frostbite can set in days after the initial exposure. Break the ice on the water troughs if it closes again. And we keep the range going, because when they come back, they're going to be cold, and they're going to need something hot immediately." "That's a lot." "It's a list," she said. "Lists aren't hard. Do the first thing, then the second thing, then the third thing." She handed him his coat from the hook by the back door. "Water troughs first. Take the mallet." He took the mallet and went out. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. The range ticked. Wind pressed against the east window with the steady insistence of something that had no particular feeling about what was behind the glass. The house was as warm as she could keep it, and the food stores were where she had put them, and the men inside were resting. She picked up her mother's recipe journal from the windowsill. She didn't open it. She just held it for exactly the amount of time it took her to feel her own heartbeat settle from the pace it had been running at since Ethan walked in with the Gentry Hand's message. Then she put it down and started on the soup. What she did in the next 4 hours was not dramatic, which was its own kind of drama. She went through the food stores with a precision that went beyond her usual careful management and became something closer to military. She counted every pound of dried meat, every cup of flour, every jar of preserved vegetables. She calculated 3 scenarios, the storm breaking in 2 days, in 4 days, in 7, and established exactly how much could be consumed per day in each scenario without risking genuine shortage. She then reorganized the pantry shelves accordingly, grouping what was immediate and what was reserve. And she marked the reserve section with a strip of red cloth from the mending basket so that anyone who came in and opened the pantry door would know without being told which supplies were not to be touched. She fed the remaining men twice. She kept the coffee going. She checked Hatchet's hands every 2 hours and made him do the flexing exercises the Garnet woman had described, which he did with the stoic dutifulness of someone who had long since stopped having opinions about being told what to do by people who knew more than he did about a given subject. She sent Charlie to check on the cattle in the near draw 3 times, because she didn't trust reports at second hand when she could have them at first. Each time he came back, she asked him specific questions. How many animals? Were they moving or standing still? Was the draw blocked on the windward side? And she logged the answers against what she already knew. None of this was the work she had been paid to do. She was a cook, but she was also a woman who had spent 7 years running a business that wasn't hers, and she understood resource management the way some people understand music, not because she had been taught it formally, because she had been living inside it long enough that the patterns were instinctive. The storm peaked in the early evening of the 6th day and began incrementally to ease. She'd feel it before she could prove it. The sound of the wind against the window changed pitch, slightly still loud, still vicious, but with a quality that was different from the wall of sound it had been for 4 days. Like pressure releasing from a sealed space. She stood at the window and watched the darkness and calculated. Charlie came in from his 4th check of the cattle draw with snow in his eyebrows and the news that 3 of the animals at the edge of the cluster were down. How down? She asked. 2 are up and moving, 1's not. Show me in the morning if the storm lightens. Don't go back out tonight. He nodded. He was 14 years old, and his hands were red from the cold, and his hair was doing 3 different things, and he had been working alongside her all day without complaint, which was something she noted and filed away alongside other things she had noticed about Charlie Voss over the past 3 months. Sleep, she said. What about you? I'll sleep when they're back. Looked like he wanted to argue. Yeah. Instead, he picked up the book from the work table, The Texas Cattle Drive History, and sat down in the chair by the range with it, and she understood that he was not going to sleep either, and that arguing about it was pointless. She made more soup. They came back at 2 in the morning. She heard the barn door first, the specific iron-on-iron sound of the latch she knew by now, and then voices, low and tired, and then boots on the back step. She had the range up, and the soup hot and the coffee fresh before the door opened. Ethan came in first. He looked like he had been through something serious. His coat was crusted with ice at the collar, and his eyebrows were white, and there was a cut above his left cheekbone that had bled and frozen in a pattern that made her press her mouth flat to keep from making a sound she didn't mean to make. Tom was behind him, then Burl, then Mackay, who was walking with a careful quality that suggested he had either twisted an ankle or was nursing a rib. Sit, she said. None of them argued. She started with soup, just getting something hot into 4 bodies that had been in extreme cold for 4 hours. Then coffee. Then she came around the table and looked at the cut on Ethan's face from close enough to assess it properly. What happened? She asked. Fell, he said. Fell or someone introduced your face to something. Pause. The second one. She wet a cloth with clean water and pressed it to the cut. Didn't flinch, which told her it hurt more than he was showing. How many were there? 7 that we saw. They had a surveyor with them, hired man, not Real's regular people. Younger. He paused. He didn't want to be there, in the storm. Armed men. Another pause, he cooperated. She pressed the cloth firmer. Meaning? Meaning he told us which stakes they'd driven and where, and signed a statement to that effect in front of Tom as witness. He looked at her from under the cloth. Going to be a very useful witness at the territorial court. Pulled the cloth back. The cut was not deep, but it would bruise badly. She folded the cloth and pressed it back. And the armed men? Left when it became clear they'd been identified and documented. He paused. The storm helped. She looked at him. The storm helped how, she said. Tom made a sound that was possibly a laugh. We knew the land, he said. They didn't. She understood. Men who knew Iron Ridge's territory could move through a blizzard using the landmarks they'd navigated 1,000 times, the fence line angles, the draw positions, particular pitch of the terrain that told you where you were, even when you couldn't see 20 feet. Men who had arrived on the property 2 weeks ago for a fraudulent survey could not. Use the blizzard, she said. The blizzard was already there, Ethan said. We just used it better than they did. She held the cloth to his face and looked at him, ice-crusted and bruised, and sitting at her kitchen table at 2 a.m, with a signed statement from a cooperative surveyor and 4 men who had ridden through a blizzard and come back, and she felt something so clear and so sudden that she had to look away from it. She went back to the stove and poured more coffee. Mackay, she said, without turning around. You're favoring your left side. Come here after you eat. Mackay made a sound. It's nothing. It's either a cracked rib or a pulled muscle, and the treatment's different for each, she said. So come here when you're done so I can tell you which. Silence. Yes, ma'am, Mackay said. Charlie had fallen asleep in the chair by the range with the cattle drive book open across his chest, which was where Evelyn found him when she went for the coffee pot. She looked at him for a moment, the angularity of him, the ink stains on his fingers even now. Book he had been reading about men who drove cattle across 1,000 miles of Texas, because what else was a person supposed to do with a world that was this large and this dangerous and this relentlessly interesting? She left him where he was. She pulled a blanket from the shelf and put it over him without waking him, and she went back to the table and the men who needed feeding and the work that was still in front of her. In the morning, the storm had broken enough to see the ridge. Evelyn stood at the east window at 5:30 with her coffee and watched the first gray light come up over the mountains and illuminate a landscape that looked like it had been remade from scratch. Everything was white and still and absolutely silent in the way that only happens after a major storm, when the world seems to be pausing to assess its own damage. One cow had been lost in the near draw. Tom found her in the morning light, half covered in snow, and made the notation in the ranch record with the matter-of-fact sadness of a man who has kept these records for years and knows the cost of a hard winter in specific and irrefutable numbers. Hatchet's hands were going to be all right. She was fairly certain of this by the morning. The color was returning in the right progression, and he had feeling in all his fingers, which was what mattered. Kai had a cracked rib. She strapped it for him with a length of clean cloth and told him no lifting for 2 weeks, which he accepted with the relieved expression of a man who had been hoping for exactly that prescription but would not have asked for it himself. Ethan's face had bruised exactly as she'd expected, a deep purple spread from the cheekbone toward the eye that would look significantly worse before it looked better. He came into the kitchen in the early morning, and she looked at it in the better light and did not comment on it, because some things were better assessed without words. Sat down at the work table. The statement from the surveyor, he said, combined with the coordinated filing from the Gentry and Halverson. Properties, my lawyer thinks the territorial court challenge can move forward as early as April. April is 2 months away, she said. A lot can happen in 2 months. Yes, she said, it can. She poured him coffee. But a lot already happened in one night. He looked at her. There it was again, that thing between them that she had been refusing to name for 3 months. It was more insistent now than it had been before. Probably because last night had stripped something away. Not walls, exactly. More like a layer of unnecessary careful distance that they had both been maintaining out of habit and decorum, and the uncertain logic of 2 people who had arrived at something neither of them had planned. She turned back to the stove. Breakfast in 30 minutes, she said. Evelyn. She turned. He was looking at her with the same directness he had shown that first morning in Harlan's diner, the look that actually saw her, that didn't slide away and come back. In the morning light, with the storm broken and the ridge visible again, and the kitchen warm from the range, he said, You kept this ranch alive last night. Not me. She felt the weight of it land somewhere in her chest. Kept it alive out there, she said. I kept it alive in here. She held his gaze. That's how it works. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any they'd had before. The silence of 2 people who have said something true and know it, and don't need to add anything to it to make it more true than it already is. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady. Eggs went in the pan. The morning came up clear and cold over Iron Ridge Ranch, and the world outside the kitchen window was white and enormous and entirely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside it. And Evelyn Hart stood at the iron range with the smell of coffee in the air and her mother's recipe journal on the windowsill and cooked breakfast for 14 people who were still alive because a storm had been used well. By people who knew the land they were standing on. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The territorial court filing moved faster than anyone expected. This was not because the court was efficient. Frontier territorial courts were famously the opposite of efficient, operating on a schedule dictated by circuit judges who covered enormous geographic areas and arrived when they arrived, not when they were needed. It's fast, because the surveyor's signed statement, combined with the coordinated documentation from 3 separate property owners, constituted something the syndicate's legal team had apparently not anticipated. Pattern of conduct argument rather than an individual property dispute. A single rancher challenging a water rights claim was a routine matter that could be delayed and complicated and worn down over years. 3 ranchers with documented evidence of coordinated fraudulent surveying activity was something closer to a territorial fraud case, and territorial fraud cases attracted a different quality of judicial attention. Ethan's lawyer sent word in late March that the circuit judge had agreed to hear the matter in Garnet in the second week of April. Evelyn heard this at breakfast. When Ethan read the letter aloud at the table, a habit he had developed over the winter, reading correspondence to the assembled men rather than in private, which she had come to understand was less about transparency and more about the particular kind of respect he had for the people who worked his land. They had a right to know what was happening on it. She said nothing during the reading. After breakfast, when the men had gone out, and Charlie was doing the washing up with the noisy inefficiency he always brought to tasks he considered beneath his intellectual station, she said, should prepare for real to make an offer before the hearing. Ethan looked up from the letter he was rereading. Kind of offer. A settlement. Something generous enough to be tempting and structured so that accepting it looks like pragmatism rather than capitulation. She poured herself the last of the coffee. They know, the surveyor testified. They know what that means for the fraud argument. If they let this reach a judge, they lose not just Iron Ridge, but their entire strategy in this county. Set the letter down. You think they'll fold. I think they'll try to negotiate before they fold. There's a difference. She sat down. The offer will be real money. Enough to make a reasonable person think twice. He looked at her. Are you telling me not to take it? I'm telling you to know what it is before you respond to it. She turned her cup in her hands. What's Iron Ridge worth to you? Not in dollars. The actual answer. Quiet for a moment. The question was not one that a man like Ethan answered quickly, because a man like Ethan understood that quick answers to important questions were usually wrong answers dressed up as decisive ones. I built this place, he said finally. Not with family money, not with a loan from someone who could afford to lose it. I built it with 11 years of specific daily decisions, most of which were wrong the first time and had to be corrected. He paused. Clara is buried on the North Ridge. Another pause shorter. It's worth whatever they offer, plus everything I have left over. Evelyn looked at her cup. Then when the offer comes, she said, you know what to say. The offer came 10 days later, delivered by a lawyer she hadn't seen before, not Real's usual man, but someone more senior, better dressed. The careful manner of a person who was accustomed to negotiating significant amounts of money without showing on his face that the amounts were significant. He arrived on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak with Ethan privately, and Ethan told him that his kitchen manager was also his operational advisor, and that private in this context meant the 3 of them. The lawyer looked at Evelyn once. She met his gaze with the same expression she used for pantry inventory attentive, assessing, entirely without performance. He accepted the condition. The offer was $22,000 for full title to Iron Ridge Ranch, including water rights, mineral rights, and all improvements. Was, she knew, a significant sum. It was also, she knew, approximately half of what Iron Ridge was genuinely worth by any reasonable assessment of the land, the herd, and the water access. She kept this arithmetic off her face and watched Ethan. He listened to the full presentation without interrupting. When the lawyer finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said no. The lawyer recalibrated. This was visible a small adjustment in posture, a slight change in the angle of his approach. He had more to offer. He had been authorized, he said, go to $26,000, which represented the maximum his clients were prepared to extend given the legal uncertainties currently facing both parties. Ethan said, "The legal uncertainty is yours, not mine. My position has been clear since 1871. Mr. Caldwell, the cost of litigation. Less than selling my ranch at half its value." He stood. "Thank you for coming out." The lawyer left. Tom, who had been visible in the yard throughout and had clearly timed his proximity to the back window with more deliberateness than he would have admitted, came in 5 minutes later and poured himself coffee with the studied casualness of a man who had not been listening. "Well," he said. 26,000, Ethan said. Tom made a sound. "That's real money, it is. But you said no." "I said no." Tom drank his coffee and looked at Evelyn, and then at Ethan, and then at his coffee again. "Good," he said, and went back outside. Court hearing was set for April 14th. On April 9th, Harlan Briggs came to Iron Ridge. Evelyn was in the kitchen when she heard the unfamiliar wagon come through the gate, and she was at the pass-through window. The kitchen faced the yard before she consciously decided to look. She recognized him before she had finished processing that she was looking. The shape of him, the way he sat a wagon with his belly forward and his elbows out, was as familiar to her as anything in the world and as unwelcome as most of it. She went back to the stove. She heard him ask for Mr. Caldwell. She heard Tom's neutral response. She heard boots on the porch and then the main room door. She stayed in the kitchen. She told herself she was staying in the kitchen because she was in the middle of a bread batch that could not be left, which was true. She told herself it had nothing to do with not wanting to be in the same room as Harlan Briggs, which was less true. Bread was real. The bread needed her. She stayed. Charlie came in through the back door approximately 8 minutes later with the particular energy of someone carrying news they know is important. "Uncle's here," he said. "I know, he's talking to Mr. Caldwell in the front room." "I know." Charlie looked at the bread dough she was working. "You kneading that or punishing it?" She looked at her hands. She lightened her grip on the dough and said nothing. "Doesn't look good," Charlie said. "Your uncle. He looks like the diner isn't." He stopped, apparently deciding how much of what he had observed to report. "Looks tired. Harlan always looks tired. He produces it deliberately. Makes people feel responsible for him." Charlie considered this. "That sounds like a lot of effort." "It is, but it works often enough that he keeps doing it." She shaped the loaf and put it in the pan. "What does he want?" He didn't say. "Not to me." Charlie picked up a clean cloth and began drying bowls without being asked, which was a sign that he understood the situation was serious. "Want to know what I think?" "Go ahead." "I think he heard about the court case. And about the syndicate. And I think he wants something from Mr. Caldwell because he thinks Mr. Caldwell is about to win something, and men like your uncle show up when winning is happening." He put a bowl on the shelf. "That's what I think." Evelyn looked at the bread pan. "You're 14, she said. "Almost 15. You read too much. Mr. Caldwell says there's no such thing." She almost said something and didn't. Covered the bread with a cloth and let it rise and went back to work. And it was 20 minutes before Ethan came into the kitchen alone. Up, he had the careful look of someone sorting through information. "He wants his niece back," he said. She turned from the stove. "Excuse me. He says the diner has suffered, that he's made mistakes. He wants to make them right." Ethan paused. He used the phrase family obligation more than once. She looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said it wasn't my decision to make." He leaned against the doorframe. "'Cause it isn't." She set down the spoon she was holding. "What else did he want?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He heard about the court case. He seems to think that if the hearing goes well, my position in the county improves considerably. He made some references to potential business opportunities, investment possibilities." A pause. He was not very subtle about it. "He's never been subtle. He thinks it reads as confidence." She picked the spoon back up. "He wants to reconnect with me so that he can leverage the connection to you." Ethan looked at her. "That's a fairly dark reading of a man who says he wants to repair a family relationship. I've known him my whole life." She turned back to the stove. "Is he still here?" "In the front room." She was quiet for a moment. Then she untied her apron, folded it, and laid it on the work table. "I'll talk to him." "You don't have to." "I know." She smoothed the front of her dress, which was a habit and not a nervousness, or so she told herself. "But I have things to say to him. I might as well say them." Harlan was sitting in the front room with his hat in his lap and the particular expression of a man who was performing remorse and was aware that the performance needed to be convincing. He had gained weight since she had last seen him. Face had the flushed, slightly puffed quality of a man who had been eating his feelings, which in Harlan's case she suspected meant eating considerably more of the cooking than had been available to him since October. "Evie," he said. He stood, which he had not always bothered to do. "Harlan." She sat down in the chair across from him. Not the chair closest to the door, the one that put the full width of the room between them. "Got your letter." "I know." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm not a good writer." "The writing was fine," she said. "It was the content." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I may have said some things. You said my mother would be ashamed of me." She said it without heat, which was harder than saying it with heat would have been. Heat would have given him something to deflect. "I've had 3 months to decide how I feel about that. Now, Ivy, I feel nothing about it," she said. "Because it isn't true, and you knew it wasn't true when you wrote it. And the reason you wrote it was because you were angry that I left and you wanted to hurt me." She held his gaze. "D, my mother would have told you exactly what I'm about to tell you, in the quiet voice that was worse than yelling, and she would have been right." Waited. "I am not coming back to the diner," she said. "Not for any renegotiated arrangement. Not for back wages. Not for any reason you've come up with on the ride over. That is finished." She let that settle. "If you want to have a conversation about something else, I'll listen." "That part is not a conversation." Harlan looked at his hat. Performance of remorse had shifted into something less performed, a smaller, more genuine deflation that she recognized as the real Harlan under the operational Harlan, the version that surfaced when the usual tools weren't working. See. She did not feel sorry for him. She felt something more complicated, which was the specific sadness of seeing a person clearly and knowing they were never going to be different from what they were. "Diner's struggling," he said. "I know. I've had 3 cooks since October. None of them stayed past 6 weeks. I know that, too." Looked up. "How?" "Because I cook for 14 people every day, and I understand what a cook's work is worth, and I know what you pay and what you don't." She looked at him steadily. "If you want the diner to stop struggling, pay a cook a fair wage and treat them like someone whose skill you need. That's the advice." He turned the hat again. It was a gesture she remembered from childhood, the hat turning, the small circular motion that meant he was calculating. "Seem to be doing well here." "I am." "Caldwell treats you all right?" She looked at him. "Yes." Something moved through Harlan's face that she couldn't quite categorize. Not jealousy. Harlan had never been possessive of her in any emotional sense, only in the financial one. Closer to a recalibration, the look of a man revises an estimate he had held for a long time. "You're different," he said. "I've been different for years," she said. "Just weren't paying attention." He left an hour later. She walked him to the door and watched the wagon move back through the gate and down the road toward Garnet, and she stood on the porch in the April cold for longer than she needed to, watching until the wagon was gone and the road was just a road. Ethan came to stand beside her. "How did it go?" he asked. "The way it needed to." She turned from the road. "He won't come back." "Are you sure?" "He got what he came for, to see how the land lay. Now he knows." She went back inside. "He'll find another angle." That's what Harlan does. But not through me. Hearing was on a Tuesday. Evelyn did not attend. It was not because she wasn't welcome. Ethan had said specifically that she could come if she wanted to, and Tom had offered to stay at the ranch in her place so she could ride in. She declined because 14 people still needed to eat, and the ranch still needed managing, and because she had decided that her contribution to this particular fight had already been made, in a kitchen in January over a land deed clause that a hired lawyer had missed. She found out the result at 4 in the afternoon, when she heard riders coming up the road faster than they usually did. She was in the yard hanging the week's washing. It was a clear, cold day with enough wind to dry things properly, and she heard them before she saw them. 3 horses moving at a pace that meant news. She set down the sheet she was holding and waited. Tom came through the gate first, with Burl behind him and Mackay's younger brother, who had ridden into town for supplies and had apparently waited to ride back with the news. Tom was not a man who smiled easily. He had a face built for neutral assessments and careful information delivery. Something was happening to the left side of his mouth that was not his usual expression. "Judge ruled in our favor," he said. "All 3 properties. The syndicate's water claim was declared fraudulent based on the surveyor's testimony and the coordinated documentation." He paused. Real's lead lawyer apparently argued for 2 hours and accomplished nothing. Judge gave him 20 minutes to respond to the fraud finding, and he used 17 of them to essentially repeat himself. Evelyn stood in the yard with a wet sheet in her hands. "North Fork?" she asked, confirmed to Iron Ridge. "Full rights, going back to 1871. Tom's left side of the mouth moved further. Caldwell's on his way back. He stopped to file the certified copy at the recorder's office. She looked at the wet sheet. She hung it on the line. She picked up the next one. Burl was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "That's it," he said. "You just go back to the washing?" "Washing still needs doing," she said. He shook his head and rode toward the barn. She heard him laugh the full, surprised laugh of a man who hadn't expected to find something funny, and she let herself feel what she was feeling, which was not triumph exactly, and not relief exactly, but something that partook of both and was perhaps more durable than either. Ethan came back at 6. She had dinner ready, a proper dinner, not the functional meals of the long winter, but something that acknowledged that a specific thing had happened and deserved acknowledgement. Roasted beef with the last of the winter root vegetables and sourdough bread from a starter that was now 3 months old and had developed a particular depth of flavor that she had not planned and could not have planned, and that she was quietly proud of. She had also made a pie, not for the diner, not for anyone, for the table, for the evening, for 14 people who had spent a hard winter on a piece of land that was now, officially and permanently, their employers to keep. Ethan came into the kitchen before dinner. He looked tired. Not the exhaustion of winter hard work, but the specific tiredness that comes after a long period of sustained tension finally releases the body's accounting for everything it had been holding without showing. Bruise from the storm night had long since faded, but she thought she could see in the set of his jaw the place where it had been. Looked around the kitchen. He looked at the stove and the bread and the pie cooling on the window ledge. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "Dinner?" "For January," he said, "the deed clause." She shook her head. "That was your deed. I just read it. Evelyn." He said her name in a way he hadn't said it before, not the name as a label, not the name as the beginning of a sentence. Just her name. "I know what you did. Not just in January. The whole winter. The storm, the stores, the men." He stopped. "The place survived because of you. I want you to know I know that." She stood at the stove and looked at him and felt the thing she had been refusing to name for 4 months pressing against the inside of her chest, with the patient insistence of something that was not going to continue to be refused indefinitely. "Kept a ranch alive," she said. "You kept the land it sits on. Kept it." He held her gaze. "That's my point." The word sat between them. "We." Simple, plain, and heavier than it had any right to be given that it was only 2 letters. "Ah." She turned back to the stove because dinner needed finishing, and because she needed a moment that wasn't being looked at. 15 minutes, she said. After dinner, after the men were in the bunkhouse, and Charlie had fallen asleep over his book again. In the chair by the range, Ethan came back into the kitchen. This had been their rhythm all winter, the late evening, the kitchen, the conversations that were a different kind of conversation. But tonight felt different from other nights, in the way that nights feel different when something that has been unresolved for a long time is moving toward resolution whether you want it to or not. He sat at the work table. She was cleaning up, the last task of the day, rhythm of it so practiced, now that she could do it without thinking, which meant her mind was entirely free to think about other things. "I want to show you something," he said. She turned. He had a folded document on the table. Not a letter, something more formal, with the particular look of legal paper. He unfolded it and pushed it toward her. She came to the table and looked at it. Deed. The property described was a building lot on the main street of Garnet. She recognized the cross-street reference from her years in town with an existing structure described as a 1-story commercial building in sound condition, approximately 800 square feet, with a working kitchen and street-facing window. It was signed over to Evelyn Hart. She read it twice. Second reading was not because she had misunderstood the first. It was because she needed the time. "The building's been empty since the milliner left last fall," Ethan said. His voice had the careful quality of a man who has prepared something and is now watching to see how it is received. "I bought it in February." Before the hearing, he paused. "I didn't want you to feel like it was contingent on anything." She looked at the deed. She looked at him, February. When Reel made the first offer, he turned his coffee cup once. I started thinking about contingencies, about what would happen to the various people at this ranch if things went wrong. Tom has savings. The hands have other options, Charlie. He stopped. Charlie is going to be fine regardless. He's got that quality. He paused. "You had $11.40 in your boot when you left Garnet. I counted. You counted. You set it on the work table one evening. Wasn't trying to stopped. I noticed. She looked at the deed again. Restaurant, 800 square feet, a working kitchen and a street-facing window. The thing she had told herself for 7 years was impossible. The thing that had lived in the back of her mind as a kind of fiction she kept for the hard days, the shape of the life she wanted, if wanting, were allowed to have a shape. I don't know what to say, she said. She was surprised to find this was true. She who always knew what to say. You don't have to say anything, he said. It's yours regardless. That's the point of it. It doesn't depend on anything. You can go start your restaurant and I'll find another cook. He said this with the flat honesty that was his most reliable characteristic. Or you can stay here and open the restaurant as something that runs alongside this when you're ready. Or you can sell the building and use the money for something else entirely. A pause. Point is that the choice is yours. Completely yours. I want you to have something that nobody can auction off. She stood at the work table with the deed in her hands and felt the precision of what he had done, not a gesture, not a performance of generosity, but something constructed with the same careful attention he brought to everything. Give her something that no one else's decision could take from her. She folded the deed along its original creases. I'm not leaving Iron Ridge, she said. He was quiet. Not because of this, she said. You should know that. If I were going to leave, a building wouldn't be the thing that changed it. She looked at him. I'm not leaving because she stopped. Said it. Because I don't want to. Kitchen was very still. Why don't you want to? He asked. His voice was careful in a way that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with the particular precision of a man who needs to hear a specific answer and is afraid of hearing a different one. Ah. She looked at him across the work table in the kitchen that she had cleaned and organized and learned by feel over 4 months, in the house that she had held together through a blizzard, on the land that had just been confirmed as his by a territorial court, partly because she had read a deed carefully on a January afternoon. This is where I want to be, she said. Not the ranch. Here. She set the deed on the table between them. With you. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. He looked at the deed. He looked at her. He stood up from the work table, and he did not say anything dramatic or poetic about it, because he was not a dramatic or poetic man. She would not have believed him if he had been. He said, I was hoping that was what you meant. She said, I know you were. I've been hoping it since about February, he said. I know that too. Was I obvious? She looked at him. No, but I pay attention to specific details. Something broke open on his face then, the something that was better than a smile, the thing she had been cataloging since the first morning. It was not polished. It made him look younger and slightly uncertain and more human than she had ever seen him, and she found she preferred it to anything more composed. Picked up the deed and put it in her apron pocket. Dinner was good tonight, she said. He laughed. Actual laughter, short and real, surprised out of him. Yes, he said. It was. In the weeks after the hearing, the county changed in the particular way that frontier counties change when a corrupt strategy collapses quickly, specific social recalibration of people who had been watching to see which direction was safe and had now received their answer. Real syndicates man pulled out of Garnett County by May. Legal challenge against Gentry and Halverson was formally withdrawn. Ware family, who had sold their creek frontage for $400, had grounds for a fraud recovery claim that Ethan's lawyer volunteered to assist with at cost. None of this was clean or fast or entirely satisfying. Ware's recovery would take years and was not guaranteed. Syndicate would regroup somewhere else and do the same thing to people who weren't lucky enough to have 3 coordinated ranchers and a signed surveyor's statement. Frontier was like that, one problem resolved, the next one already forming somewhere over the ridge. But in Garnett itself, something shifted. The people who had watched Harlan's auction in February and said nothing were suddenly very interested in Evelyn Hart. Mrs. Aldrich, who had left fabric at the diner's back door years ago, stopped her on the main street one afternoon and asked, with the particular warmth of a woman who wanted to be clearly on the right side of history, how she was getting on. Wife of the county recorder, a woman named Delphine, who had a sharp face and a sharper intelligence, introduced herself at the dry goods store and mentioned, entirely casually, that she had heard about the rock formation clause and that it was a remarkable piece of close reading. Evelyn accepted these overtures with the same quality she brought to everything attentive, assessing, without performance. She was not going to be angry at people for doing what people did in uncertain situations, which was wait. She understood waiting. She had done a great deal of it herself. What she didn't accept was the version of events that began circulating, the version in which Ethan had rescued her, in which she was a passive beneficiary of a wealthy man's largesse, in which the story was about him and she was the backdrop. First time she heard this version, in the dry goods store, she said nothing. Second time, at the post office, she corrected it once, plainly. I read his deed and found a clause his lawyer missed. I managed the ranch stores through a blizzard. I also make very good biscuits. Those are the things that happened. The woman at the post office blinked. All right, she said. Thank you, Evelyn said, and mailed her letter. She went to see the building in Garnet on a Thursday in late May. Ethan drove her in. He didn't offer to come inside with her, which she appreciated. He waited with the wagon while she went in alone, which was right. This was hers to see first. By herself, without anyone else's reaction in the room to manage. The building was smaller than 800 square feet had sounded. It was also larger than the Garnet Diner, which had seemed very large when she was 15. Kitchen was at the back, as it should be, with a wood range that would need replacing and a dry sink that was sound and shelving that was adequate. Front room had the street-facing window that the deed had described, and the morning light came through it in a clean, wide band that fell across the plank floor and illuminated the dust and the emptiness and the particular quality of an unused space that has not yet become anything. She stood in the middle of the front room. She was not going to open this restaurant tomorrow, or next month. She had a ranch to feed, and a kitchen she knew well, and a life she was still assembling from its component parts. Carefully, the way her mother had taught her to assemble a good meal with patience, with attention to what was actually there rather than what you wished were there, and with the understanding that the best things took the time they took and could not be hurried without cost. But she was going to open it. The thought was not dramatic. Sat in her chest with the same quiet permanence as her mother's recipe journal, as the $11.40 as the click of a door latch on the inside. She walked to the kitchen. She put her hand on the edge of the range. The iron was cold, and the room smelled of dust and old wood. Somewhere on the main street outside a horse was being annoyed about something, and the morning light was very good in here. Evelyn Hart stood in the kitchen of her own building and felt the specific weight of a future that was hers to build. She went back outside. Ethan was leaning against the wagon, with his hat tilted against the morning sun, watching the street with the patient quality of a man who was comfortable waiting. Said, "The range needs replacing," she said. "Shelving is adequate. The window is good." And she looked at the building's front face. Plain wood, a simple door, the window. Nothing remarkable. Everything necessary. "And it's mine," she said. He looked at her. That thing happened on his face again, the thing that wasn't a smile but was better. "Yes," he said, "it is." She climbed up onto the wagon seat. Morning was clear, and the road back to Iron Ridge was 12 miles of country. She knew now the way she knew her own kitchen, by feel, by sound, by the particular weight of it under her. She had not yet decided all the details of what came next. But she had the building. She had the recipe journal. She had $40 a month in cash and a door with a latch on the inside and a man beside her on the wagon seat who had paid $500 not to own her, but to give her the room to own herself. Details would come. She was not in a hurry. The road was hers and the morning was wide, and she had learned over one hard and extraordinary winter that the difference between a woman with nothing and a woman with everything she needed was not always money or luck or the intervention of someone with more power than she had. Sometimes it was simply the decision to stop waiting for permission to take up the space she had always deserved. The wagon rolled north. 12 miles of Colorado opened up ahead of them, and Evelyn Hart rode into it with her hands in her lap and her mother's recipe journal in her pocket and the deed to a building folded against her heart. Summer Evelyn Hart opened Heart and Hearth. The range broke down twice. First time was 3 days before the opening, when the flue collapsed inward from a bad joint that the stove installer had assured her was sound. She discovered this at 5 in the morning when smoke started filling the kitchen instead of going up and out, and she stood in the gray pre-dawn with her eyes watering and her apron already on, and made a decision in approximately 45 seconds. She went to the Garnet hardware merchant's back door and knocked until he answered in his nightclothes, and she bought the replacement joint herself and paid a carpenter named Aldous Misses, Aldrich's nephew, who owed his aunt a favor, and was willing to transfer that obligation to fix it before noon. Fixed it before 10. The second breakdown was on the actual opening day, a Saturday in late June when the oven temperature ran so hot that the first 2 batches of biscuits came out the color of old leather on the bottom. Nah. She scraped them, adjusted the damper, and made the 3rd batch correctly. Nah. And by the time the first customers came through the door at 7 in the morning, there were biscuits on the warming shelf that smelled exactly the way they were supposed to smell. Nobody sitting at one of the 4 tables Evelyn had arranged in the front room knew about the leather-bottomed failures cooling in the ash bucket out back. Ethan knew. He had been there at 5 in the morning for the flu, and he had come in on the opening Saturday to carry the chairs from the wagon she'd used to transport them. And he had watched her scrape the burnt biscuits into the bucket without a word and go back to the dough. He had started? No, she said, not rudely. Just accurately. Sat down at the smallest table, one by the window, gong and stayed out of her way, which was what she needed and which he understood. And she thought, not for the first time that summer, that this specific quality in him, the ability to be present without inserting himself, was possibly the thing she valued most. The opening day was not the triumphant, uncomplicated success of a story told cleanly. It was messier than that. She ran out of coffee by 9. Man she didn't know sent back his eggs because he wanted them harder. She made them harder without comment because the customer was paying, and the eggs were eggs, and picking a battle over egg doneness was not a battle worth picking on her first day. A woman named Pruitt, who had apparently been a close friend of Mrs. Portis, Ethan's former ranch cook, came in specifically to be unimpressed and left 3/4 through her meal, and Evelyn watched her go and felt the small specific sting of it and then went back to the stove. By noon, all 4 tables had turned twice. By 2 in the afternoon, she had served 31 people. By the time she locked the front door at 6 and sat down on the floor of the kitchen with her back against the cold range and her feet stretched out in front of her, she had made enough in one day to cover 1 week's rent on the building and most of the cost of the replacement joint for the flue. She sat there for a long time. Ethan came in through the back door at 6:30. He had gone back to the ranch in the afternoon to deal with something Tom needed, and he had returned with the specific punctuality of a man who has been watching the clock without admitting he was watching the clock. Looked at her on the floor. He sat down on the floor beside her, which was not a thing a man of his height did gracefully, but he did it anyway. How bad, he asked. She said, 31 covers. Ran out of coffee. Mrs. Pruitt left early. Mrs. Pruitt leaves everything early. She left the county fair after 20 minutes in 1876, and she's still explaining why to anyone who'll listen. Evelyn almost laughed. The biscuits were right by the 3rd batch. I know. I had 2 of them. She looked at the kitchen around her, the range that had betrayed her twice, and that she had corrected twice, the shelving she had organized herself, the work table that was already marked with the particular stains and cuts of a day's real cooking. Mother's recipe journal was on the shelf between the salt crock and the coffee tin, where she had put it the first morning she came in to set up. My mother would have had opinions about the table arrangement, she said. Good opinions or bad? She always had good opinions. She just had a lot of them. She paused. She would have liked you. He was quiet for a moment. What makes you say that? She liked people who meant what they said. Evelyn looked at her hands. She didn't like people who made a lot of noise about their intentions and then did something different. She said, you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by watching what they did when they thought no one was looking. She paused. Brought a horse for a woman you'd never met because 12 miles was a long way to ride double. Practical. But you also brought a good horse. Calm one. She glanced at him. You thought about what the horse would be like for someone who'd been having a bad morning. Looked at her. I just grabbed the calmest one. I know, she said. That's what I mean. They sat on the kitchen floor of Heart and Hearth until the light went from the window and the building cooled around them, and they talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, which is what people do when they have arrived somewhere after a long, difficult journey and don't need to be anywhere else immediately. Question of marriage came up in September, which was not how either of them would have scripted it if they had been the scripting kind. They were at Iron Ridge, in the kitchen, her kitchen still, even though she now divided her days between the ranch and the restaurant, finding a balance that was imperfect and constantly adjusting in the way of all real balances. It was an evening in early fall, with the aspens going gold on the ridge and the air beginning to have the particular edge that announced Colorado was preparing to do what it always did. They had been talking about the restaurant's accounts, which she kept herself in a ledger she bought from the dry goods store and maintained with the same systematic precision she brought to pantry inventories. Numbers were not spectacular. They were, however, real, and they were hers. Gone, and they were moving in the right direction, which was all she required of numbers at this stage. Ethan had been listening to her talk through the ledger. He was good at this. Got the active listening that didn't interrupt or redirect, but asked precise follow-up questions that indicated he was actually processing what she said. And then he had said, in the same tone he used for most things, "I'd like to marry you, if that's something you want." She looked up from the ledger. He held her gaze with the same directness he had shown the first morning in Harlan's diner. Not nervous, exactly, but present in a way that acknowledged the weight of what he had said. "It's not a very romantic proposal," she said. "No," he agreed. "I could try again with more ceremony, but it would come out the same." "I'm not good at ceremony." "I know that. I know what I want," he said. "I want you as my partner, completely and permanently. Not as my cook, and not as someone who lives in my house by arrangement." He paused. "I should have said it earlier. I didn't, because I wasn't sure it was what you wanted, and I didn't want to make you feel like you owed me anything." She closed the ledger. She thought about 7 years in Harlan's kitchen, where the options available to her had been so narrow that the narrowness itself had become invisible, the way walls become invisible when you've lived between them long enough. She thought about $11.40 in a boot heel. She thought about the deed to a building that was hers, regardless of anything else. She thought about a man who had brought a calm horse. "I want it," she said. "That's my answer. I want it." He exhaled. She had not noticed until that moment that he had been holding something carefully still. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. It was not a scene from a novel. There were no tears and no grand gestures, and the kitchen smelled of the day's cooking, and somewhere outside Tom was shouting at someone about a fence post. But it was real, and it was theirs, and in Evelyn's experience, real things that were yours were worth considerably more than beautiful things that weren't. They married in November in Garnet, in the county recorder's office, because Ethan said a courthouse was the right place for a legal agreement between two serious people, and Evelyn said she agreed. Neither of them said anything further about it until Delphine, the recorder's wife, quietly arranged for the front room of the office to have flowers from her own garden, dried and pressed and arranged in 2 tin cans on the windowsill, which was the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for Evelyn since a woman she barely knew had left fabric at a back door years ago. Tom was the witness. Charlie was there, because Charlie was always present for anything significant, as if he had developed an instinct for moments that mattered. He had grown 2 inches since October and was going through a phase of wearing his hair severely parted on one side, which he had apparently gotten from a book illustration, and which he had committed to with the full conviction of someone who had not yet learned to second-guess his own style choices. After the ceremony, such as it was, they went to Heart and Hearth. She made dinner for 11 people in the kitchen of her own restaurant, which was not what most women did on their wedding evenings. She did it because it was what she wanted to do. And because there were 11 people who mattered to her, and feeding them felt like the right way to mark a day that had changed things. Biscuits were right on the first batch. Years at Iron Ridge and Heart and Hearth did not pass smoothly. Evelyn would have been suspicious of smooth. Colorado was not smooth. Life on the frontier was not smooth. The cattle market dropped badly in 1881, and Ethan had to sell a portion of the herd at prices that made the accounting painful to look at. Evelyn went through the ranch finances with him line by line, and they cut what could be cut without cutting into bone, and they got through it. Restaurant had a summer in 1882 where a contaminated water supply in Garnet hit half the town, and her customer numbers dropped to almost nothing for 6 weeks. And she kept the doors open on the strength of the supply orders she had started selling to neighboring ranch kitchens preserved goods, sauces. A sourdough starter she had begun selling in crock form to women who wanted to make their own bread and didn't know how to build one from scratch. Supply business had not been planned. It emerged from a conversation with a rancher's wife named Berta Gentry, not the rancher Ethan had coordinated with over the water rights, but his daughter-in-law, who had come in for lunch one afternoon and asked where Evelyn got her starter. When Evelyn said she made it herself, Berta had looked at her with an expression of such genuine longing that Evelyn had gone home and thought about it and come back the next week with 4 crocks of starter, priced fairly, card inside each one explaining the feeding schedule. All four sold in a day. By 1883, the supply side of Hart and Hearth was generating a consistent revenue that carried the restaurant through its slow periods. Evelyn hired a woman named Rosa to handle the front of house, which freed her to focus on the kitchen and the supply production and the accounts. Gone Hart and Hearth stopped being a thing that she was holding together by force of will alone and started being a thing that ran on its own systems, the way a well-made machine runs. She hired Rosa the way Ethan had hired her, with a clear wage, stated up front, and the explicit information that the wage would be paid on time, because that was not a variable. Rosa had looked at her when she said this. "I've worked for 4 restaurants in this territory," Rosa said. "Nobody's ever said that to me in the interview." "It shouldn't be remarkable," Evelyn said. "But I know that it is." Rosa stayed for 11 years. Charlie Voss left Iron Ridge at 17 to go east to a college that had accepted him on the strength of a written examination, which he had taken in a room above the Garnet post office with 3 other applicants, and had apparently finished so far ahead of the time limit that the proctor had checked his answers twice, thinking he must have skipped sections. She hadn't skipped anything. Ethan drove him to the stage depot on the morning he left. Evelyn packed him a cloth sack with food for the journey, proper food, not the kind of travel provisions that suggested the packer didn't think much of the traveler. It was bread and dried meat and a jar of apple preserves and 2 pieces of cake wrapped in cloth, gun, and at the bottom, tucked under, everything else. A small notebook she had bought from the dry goods store and written 1 sentence inside the front cover in her careful hand. She didn't tell him about the notebook. She let him find it. He found it on the stage, 2 hours out of Garnet. And the sentence she had written was, "Pay attention to specific details, that's where the truth lives." Sent her a letter from the college 6 months later that was 4 pages long and covered. No particular order, his impressions of the food adequate but uninspired. Quality of his professors variable, with 2 exceptions. The specific details of 3 books he had read that he thought she would find interesting. 1 paragraph at the end that said simply, "I think about Iron Ridge more than I expected to. I think about the kitchen. Thank you for letting me peel things." She kept the letter in her mother's recipe journal. The recipe journal itself had grown by the time Evelyn turned 30. Not the original. Her mother's slanting script was unchanged, the lavender smell still faintly present in the binding, the margin notes still precise and unexpectedly funny in the way her mother had been unexpectedly funny. Evelyn had added pages, sewn in at the back with the same thread her mother had used to bind the original. Her additions were different in character from her mother's, less instructional, more observational. She wrote what she had learned at Iron Ridge and what she had learned in the restaurant, and occasionally what she had learned from a particular difficult day that had nothing to do with cooking, but that the cooking had helped her get through. 1 entry, written in the winter of 1882 during the water supply trouble, read, "Bad season is not a verdict. There is information. The question is what you do with it." Another, from the spring after that, "Rosa asked me today how I knew the supply business would work. I told her I didn't know. I noticed a need and I filled it and I watched whether it held. That is the only way I have ever known anything." She did not think of herself as a philosopher. She was a cook and a businesswoman and a ranch wife and, eventually, a mother. She found that these things generated enough hard-won knowledge that the back pages of the journal filled themselves without her having to try. Children came in the way. Children came on the frontier, not always at planned times, not always without difficulty. First was a son, born in 1884, who had Ethan's jaw and Evelyn's way of looking at a room like he was cataloging it. They named him James, after Ethan's father, and called him Jamie until he was 12, and started introducing himself as James with the full dignity of a boy who had opinions about his own name. Second was a daughter, born in 1886, who had Evelyn's hands long-fingered, capable, always in motion. They named her Clara, which Ethan suggested quietly one evening, and Evelyn agreed to immediately, because Claire Caldwell had deserved to have her name spoken with love, and this was a way of doing it. Clara the daughter was in the restaurant kitchen by the time she was 6, standing on a stool to reach the work table, asking questions that revealed an intelligence that was going to be either very useful or very exhausting depending on the day. By 8, she had her own apron. By 10, she could make biscuits that Evelyn graded honestly, not to be kind but to be accurate, because accuracy was what actually helped. "These are good," Evelyn told her on a Tuesday morning when Clara was 11 and had made a batch that was genuinely good. Bottom needs another minute, but the top is right, and you got the fold. That's the hard part. Clara looked at the biscuits with the critical attention of someone who had learned to receive assessment as information rather than judgment. What if I turn the pan halfway through? Try it next time and see. She tried it next time. It worked. Evelyn watched her daughter turn the pan in the oven with the focused economy of someone doing a thing for the second time and doing it better. She felt something move through her that was not simple pride. Pride was too clean for what it actually was. It was more like recognition. The recognition of a woman who had learned everything she knew the hard way, watching someone she loved learn it better. In 1889, Harlan Briggs died. The diner in Garnet had changed hands twice since Evelyn left. Harlan had eventually sold it to a man named Cutter, who ran it adequately for 3 years before selling it again to a woman from Kansas named Marjorie, who ran it well for reasons that had everything to do with paying her cook a fair wage. Harlan had taken the money from the first sale and done various things with it that did not pan out, in the pattern of men who know how to extract value from other people's work but lack the specific discipline required to generate it themselves. Died of a heart ailment. In his rooms above the former diner, he had retained the upstairs as part of the sale arrangement with no family present. Evelyn found out from the county recorder's notice, which was posted in the Garnet weekly paper. She read it at breakfast. Ethan watched her read it. She folded the paper and set it down and drank her coffee. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about this honestly. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she said. "I was a bad man in specific ways and a mediocre man in general ways. And he took 7 years of my life and gave me almost nothing for them. And he is dead now. I feel," she paused. "Not much, which is its own kind of sad." "Why sad?" "He was the only family I had for a long time. And the feeling I have about him dying is mostly neutral." She looked at her coffee cup. "Seems like a waste of whatever we could have been to each other if he had been different." Ethan was quiet. "You're not going to say something reassuring," she said. "No," he said. "You don't need reassurance. You need to feel what you actually feel." She looked at him. He was 50 now, and the outdoors had continued to do what it always did to men who spent most of their lives in it, the particular weathering that was not unattractiveness, but was rather the visible record of years of real work. Kind of face that told you something true about a person's history. Scar above his left eyebrow was still there. The careful quality in his eyes had not changed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Turned his hand over and held hers. Sat like that for a while, in the kitchen of Iron Ridge Ranch, on a morning in 1889, with the mountains outside the window and the sound of the ranch waking up around them, and 30 years of life still ahead of them that they didn't know about yet, which was either frightening or fortunate, depending on how you looked at it. Evelyn had decided a long time ago to look at it as fortunate. Heart and Hearth became something she had not entirely predicted, which was perhaps the most honest thing that could be said about it. She had imagined a restaurant. She had built a restaurant. But the restaurant had also become, over the years, something more specific to Garnet County, a place where women who were passing through difficult circumstances sometimes found their way to the back door and asked if there was work. Not always, not in a formal or organized way. It happened enough times that Evelyn stopped being surprised by it, and she had developed, without writing it down anywhere or announcing it to anyone, a policy. If a woman came to the back door of Heart and Hearth and needed work, she got a trial. 1 week. Paid from the first day at a fair rate. At the end of the week, if the work was good, she was hired permanently. If the work was not good, Evelyn told her specifically what needed improving and offered another trial. 20 years of this policy, she had sent 3 women away. Everyone else stayed or left on their own terms when they were ready. Rosa knew about the policy. Clara knew about it. Ethan knew about it. Nobody else was officially told, because making it official would have changed what it was. It would have become a statement rather than just the way things worked at Heart and Hearth. And statements attracted a different kind of attention than she wanted. She did not think of herself as doing something remarkable. She thought of herself as running a business the way a business should be run, which was by recognizing that the quality of the work was inseparable from the quality of the conditions under which it was done. This was not a philosophy she had been taught. It was a conclusion she had reached empirically, through 7 years of being on the wrong side of the equation. In the summer of 1893, 15 years after Evelyn had walked out of Harlan's diner with $11.40 and her mother's recipe journal, a journalist came to Garnet from Denver. He was writing a series of articles about successful frontier enterprises ranches, trading operations, and one or two businesses that had grown from individual initiative into something that defined their communities. He had heard about Iron Ridge Ranch, which was now one of the larger cattle operations in the county. He had also heard about Hart and Hearth. He wanted to interview Ethan Caldwell about frontier business and the growth of ranching in the Colorado Territory. Arrived on a Wednesday and went to the ranch first. Ethan spoke with him for 2 hours in the front room about cattle management, about water rights, the syndicate case, the 1,881 market collapse, and how he had navigated it. Journalist took extensive notes. He was good at his job. He asked follow-up questions that indicated he was actually listening, which put him in a category that Ethan respected. At the end of the 2 hours, the journalist asked, "Is there anything I haven't asked about that you think matters?" Ethan thought for a moment. "You should talk to my wife," he said. Journalist looked at his notes. "Mrs. Caldwell. She operates the restaurant in town." "She does. But before that, she managed the ranch through the winter of 1878. She read the land deed clause that won the water rights case. She organized the supply rationing during the blizzard when the syndicate's men came." Ethan paused. "The story of this ranch is not the story of one person." Journalist came to Hart and Hearth the next morning. Evelyn gave him coffee and answered his questions in the kitchen while she worked, because she was not going to stop working for an interview, and because she found that people told you more true things about themselves when they were watching you do something real. She told him about the restaurant, about the supply business, about the backdoor policy without calling it a policy. She told him about the deed clause and the surveyor's statement. She told him about her mother's recipe journal and why she kept it on the shelf between the salt crock and the coffee tin. He asked, "What would you say to a woman in the position you were in 15 years ago? Someone with nothing, working for someone who was taking everything." She was quiet for a moment. She pushed a batch of biscuits into the oven and closed the door and turned to face him. "I'd say that the hardest thing is not having nothing," she said. "The hardest thing is believing that having nothing is permanent. You are defined by what other people have decided you're worth." She paused. "I spent 7 years believing that my uncle's version of my value was the correct version. I cooked as well as I could and I saved $11, and I told myself it was temporary and I waited for something to change. What changed it? I did," she said it without drama. "Someone helped. I won't pretend otherwise. Someone with resources helped at a moment when I needed it, and that mattered. Help was only useful because I already knew what I was worth and I was ready to act on it. If I hadn't been ready, I'd have gone back to Harlan." She turned back to the stove. "External thing, the person, the opportunity, the good luck, it only works when you've already decided something internally. When you've already said, 'This is not all I am.'" The journalist wrote this down. The article ran in the Denver paper in August. It was about Iron Ridge Ranch and the water rights case and the frontier cattle industry. The section people talked about, the section that got reprinted in 2 other territorial papers, was the section about Evelyn Hart Caldwell and Hart and Hearth and a woman who had been sold for $500 in a diner and had built something that would outlast the men who had tried to define her limits. She read the article once and put it in her mother's recipe journal. What she understood. In the years after, and this was not a thing she had understood fully at 22 or even at 30, because some understanding requires time the way bread requires time, cannot be rushed without losing something essential, was that the story people wanted to tell about her life was a rescue story. A woman in trouble, a man with money, a transaction that turned into a love story. People liked that version because it had a clear shape and a clear hero and a satisfying moral that didn't require anyone to think too hard about the systems that had put a talented woman in a frontier diner for 7 years without compensation. She did not correct this version loudly. She corrected it the way her mother would have corrected it quietly, specifically, once, in a voice that people remembered afterward. The truth was more complicated and more interesting than the rescue version. Truth was that Ethan Caldwell had walked into a diner and done something decent at a moment when a decent thing was possible to do. He had resources and he had chosen to use them correctly, which was more than most people with resources managed, and she was not going to dismiss that. It mattered. The horse mattered. The wage mattered. Door with the latch on the inside mattered. The truth was also that none of it would have added up to anything if she had not already been, after 7 years of Harlan's Diner, precisely the person she was, the person who could read a land deed and find a clause a lawyer missed, could manage food stores for 16 people through a 6-day blizzard, who could look at an empty building in Garnet and see not emptiness but 800 square feet of possibility. Harlan had tried to sell her future. What he had actually done, and this was the thing she had not been able to see for years, and then suddenly could not stop seeing, was prove that her future was worth $500 to a stranger who had watched her cook from a distance for 3 years. That was not nothing. That was information. Poorly delivered, extracted under humiliating circumstances, wrapped in everything that was wrong about the world she had been born into. But information, nonetheless. She had taken that information and built a life with it. Not a perfect life. Not a life without loss or failure or the specific grinding difficulty of running 2 operations simultaneously while raising 2 children on a frontier ranch in a century that was not always interested in women who ran things. Seasons when the restaurant barely broke even. Were seasons when the cattle market made Ethan's accounts look frightening. There was a winter when Jamie got a lung sickness that took 3 months to resolve, and during which she learned exactly how fear lived in the body, not in the mind, but in the body, in the chest, in the hands that kept working, because work was the only thing she knew to do with that kind of fear. Jamie recovered. He grew up and went to law school. He had his mother's eye for documents and his father's patience and nobody's tendency toward unnecessary words, which made him effective, and he came back to Colorado and practiced in Garnet, where he eventually became the kind of lawyer who found deed clauses that other lawyers missed. Thought about telling him once. Gosh, she thought about saying, "You do this because I taught you to pay attention to specific details. I learned that from your father's land deed in 1879, and your father held on to that land because we read it together. And you exist partly because of a clause on the second page of a document that nobody bothered to read carefully." She thought about saying, "The things that lead to them things are always surprising if you trace them." She didn't say it. He would figure it out himself, the way she had figured things out herself. That was what she believed in. Finally and permanently, after everything, not rescue and not luck and not even love, though love was real and mattered more than she had been equipped to understand at 22. What she believed in was the patient accumulation of specific things. Recipe learned and practiced again. Dollar saved in the boot heel. The document read carefully, to the end, including the second page. Door that latched from the inside. These were not dramatic things. None of them would make a story that a journalist would want to write about. But they were the actual architecture of a life. And they held weight. And they held up. And they held up because she had built them herself. Last entry Evelyn added to her mother's recipe journal was written in the winter of 1895. On a Sunday evening when the ranch was quiet and the children were grown, and the restaurant was in Rosa's capable hands for the week, and Ethan was in his study reading land law with the focused attention he still brought to everything. 17 years after she had first watched him bring it to a cup of coffee in a diner he'd driven 12 miles to reach. She wrote, "My mother said a good meal is love you can taste." I think she was right, but I think she was also describing something larger than food. She was describing the whole project, the paying attention, the learning the right proportions, the willingness to start again when the first batch burns. Build what you build the way you cook what you cook, from what's available, with the skill you have, gone in the time you're given. Secret, if there is one, is not to wait until the conditions are better. Conditions are never better. You start with what you have in the kitchen you're given, and you make something worth eating. She closed the journal. She put it back between the salt crock and the coffee tin. The ranch was quiet outside. The mountains were dark. Kitchen was warm. She had built this. Not alone. She would never pretend she had built it alone, because that would have been dishonest. She had no patience left for dishonesty in any direction, including toward herself. She had built it with the help of a man who brought a calm horse and read his own deed carefully and understood, better than most, what it meant to use resources correctly. She had built it with Charlie's peeling and Tom's inventory and Rosa's front-of-house intelligence and Clara's instinct for the halfway turn of the pan. But she had built it. It was hers in the way that things are yours when you have made every decision about them from the beginning, including the decisions that were wrong, and corrected the wrong ones. And kept going. Woman her uncle had tried to sell for $500 was 63 years away from the day she would die. Beloved and clear-eyed and solvent in ways that had nothing to do with money. In the house on the north ridge of Iron Ridge Ranch, with the mountains outside the window and her mother's recipe journal on the shelf and the smell of good bread in the air. She didn't know that yet. What she knew was tonight. Quiet ranch, the warm kitchen, Ethan's voice from the study, asking if she wanted coffee. She did want coffee. She went to make it herself.